Welcome to another episode of the Break the Rules live stream. I am your host, Lev Polyakov, coming at you live once again with the great and powerful Jason, Dr. Jason Reza Jorjani. We are going to be talking today about the UFO Disclosure Project, David Grusch, the different opinion that Dr. Jorjani has on him this time around. I'm very excited for this, and as always, make sure to like, subscribe, click the bell. We are going to be doing super chats at the end, and Gnostic Foreman Neil should be around in the 30-minute time for more questions as well. And also, BTR has a Discord and a Patreon, as you can see the link right next to me here, patreon.com/breaktherules. Become a supporter today. Anyway, Jason, what exactly is going on with this difference in thought when it comes to David Grusch before and now after you've seen him making these appearances on various podcasts?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you as always, Lev. And I'm glad we had a chance to connect in person again in New York a few nights ago. It was fun. Well, I tell you, I think this is another case where I approached a situation with a degree of hopeful optimism. And, you know, when David Grusch was giving testimony to Congress, I think it was, August, he was in a very formal setting and, you know, delivering official testimony under oath. So there was a certain demeanor and a certain manner of presentation intrinsic to that context, which suggested to me that the gentleman who had provided him with all this information, these supposed, sources that he has within Black projects, had a very carefully planned agenda for disclosure, and one which I was relieved at that time to know was an agenda distinct from the soft disclosure that is organized by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Okay, so there is a soft disclosure agenda that the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, is spearheading, or at least managing in some capacity. And the naval encounters with the Tic Tacs, then the New York Times piece by Leslie Kean, and subsequent mainstream media coverage involving mainly these pilots in the Navy and their sightings. That was all part of a multi-phased disclosure program, again, managed, I think, in part from out of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines. And I had been, let's say, apprised of information relating to how they intended to roll out this phased soft disclosure, in a series of about 5 stages, going from offering limited data regarding UFOs, or UAPs as they like to call them now, to images of structures in various parts of the solar system, taken with state-of-the-art telescopes that are being deployed, to then, in a subsequent phase, archaeological excavations on Earth of structures similar to ones that are photographed, let's say, on the moons of Jupiter, and the idea was that they were going to start very far from the Earth, right, to sort of put the public at ease, and then slowly disclose the fact that these structures are also on Mars, and by the way, they are also on the moon, right on top of us. And then the focus would come to similar structures, in other words, megalithic engineering, high precision megalithic engineering on Earth. Then archaeological excavation would take place, anthropological studies would be done, and slowly over the course of like 3-4 phases, they would get to the disclosure that this phenomenon has been with us through all of human history, and that there is a genetic connection between the beings behind UFOs or UAPs and the human race. And then the focus would shift to genetics and comparative genetic analysis. And it would ultimately end with the revelation that we are connected to these beings, that in some way they engendered us or they manipulated our evolution, and that, they're not as alien as we take them to be, right? And so there was this whole program, a phase, and, it was designed in a way to, I think, from their perspective, minimize public panic, and also to, and this is very important, to prevent any retribution against the government, or rather, I should say, to prevent the government from being held accountable for a 70-year-long cover-up and for misappropriation of taxpayer funding for these black projects and so on and so forth. So part of this agenda from out of the office of the Director of National Intelligence was to act as if UFOs were being studied seriously only now for the first time, and that nothing's really being covered up, right? Well, Grusch put a huge dent in all of that. And I also heard from the people involved with that other initiative that they had not at all anticipated what he came out with, and that it wasn't cleared by them. And they, in fact, had planned for certain disclosures to be made by this Thanksgiving. It was another milestone for them, another marker to advance this program that they had designed. And they scrapped that after Grusch's testimony, because according to them, what he came out with from these sources that he has in these black projects, which included exposure of a decades-long cover-up and extremely advanced reverse engineering efforts that have taken place, even the disclosure of the possession of bodies and of, as they like to call it, non-human biologistics, which is, we'll get into all of this deceptive nomenclature in a bit. But these types of disclosure were not anticipated by that other camp. And at the time, especially given the tenor of his testimony before Congress, it gave me hope that there was another group which was interested in a more robust disclosure. And I optimistically believed that Grusch was a front man for, serious generals, admirals, high-level intelligence officials who had given deep consideration to how it was that they planned to initiate disclosure, right? And again, in a more forthright and robust manner than this nonsense we were seeing from out of the ODNI. Well, in the months since then, to just briefly answer your question, and then we'll get into more, we can follow up. But to briefly give a provisional answer to your question, in the months since then, I have seen some of Grusch's podcasts, including the recent conversation with Joe Rogan. And I hate to say this, but my distinct impression is that Grusch is okay, he has a military intelligence background. So some people have said to me, look, he's playing dumb deliberately. I actually don't think so. I mean, I have some capacity to read people, and I consider myself a relatively discerning and perceptive person. That's not the impression I get of David Grusch. Unfortunate, and if I did, actually, I would be more relieved if I did have that impression of him. But the distinct impression that I have is that Grusch is a rather unwitting tool of men who frankly have no idea what they're doing. And I suspect that his sources are relatively low-level operatives inside various black projects who maybe saw this disclosure thing unfolding from out of the ODNI and were concerned that they were going to go down with the ship. That, like, if these black programs do get blown open, despite what the intelligence community wants, despite that they wanted to act like they haven't been covering anything up, just in case the programs at Lockheed and other defense contractors get blown open, that these sources behind Grusch perhaps want to negotiate for their own immunity from prosecution in a kind of truth and reconciliation manner that's been floated in various discussions around disclosure, right? And so maybe they're trying to cover their own asses and they volunteered a certain degree of information to Grusch, but actually based on certain things, and we can get into the details, certain things that Grusch has said and the way he carries himself informally in these podcasts. First of all, he doesn't have any idea what's going on. Secondly, I don't think the people behind him really know what they're doing. And I don't think that they've thought carefully about the implications of the information that they're releasing or the ramifications that it's going to have. So that can be a point of, of opening for our conversation.
Well, what exactly would you say Grusch said? And he did say a lot, but what were some of the dumbest things that I guess you could say he said? And I do notice that there were certain things he was talking about which we talked about as well. For example, human beings being a genetic hybrid. He was talking about that, but again, he's not the first nor the last. He was also talking about how he has this theory about gods creating their own universes and how we may be training to become these gods eventually. So it looks like somebody who was, to me at least, a big Joe Rogan Experience fan as far as the kind of subjects that he was willing to entertain, but which were the ones that you would say are completely dumb and shouldn't have been said, in your opinion?
I mean, Joe Rogan Experience fan, look, that's nice. I mean, he could be, if he were an interesting guy, he could come and hang out with Joe Rogan and say whatever the hell he wants to say. But in point of fact, he is disclosing extremely dangerous information with the authorization of the Pentagon and apparently with the backing of, officials inside of black projects. Okay. So a different standard applies here. And my first problem with the things that he says is that he's all over the place. Now, I understand that one could, as a tactic, try to promote, how can we put it, like hermeneutic openness, right? Like that you want people to entertain a plethora of possible interpretations of things, right? You don't want interpretive closure. You want to start to open people's minds and so on and so forth. So you might engage in that as a tactic. I actually don't think that Grusch is doing that. From my reading of the various contradictory things that he says is that he himself really doesn't have a clear idea of what's going on. And he's floating these hypotheses, these possibilities. I mean, they're not even cohesive enough to be hypotheses, but he's floating these possibilities just like any ordinary person would, right?
Well, what are some contradictions you say of what he's talking about?
So, for example, sometimes he says things like, well, these may be extraterrestrials who have genetically engineered bodies that are humanoid or human-like so as to be able to better interact with us, right? So that's an affirmation of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the idea that these are, visitors from another planet, maybe in another star system, and that actually they may be nothing like humanity because, according to Darwinian biology, and of course there are problems with the Darwinian theory of evolution, but nonetheless, according to Darwinian biology, a life form from another star system shouldn't look all that much like us. I mean, forget panspermia for a minute. And people say this, right? A lot of mainstream biologists say it's been one of the debunkers' objections to the close encounter phenomenon is how humanoid all the entities look. And these people are like, these mainstream biologists, well, if they were really aliens, they shouldn't look anything like us. So Grusch, one of the things he says is, well, they could be aliens who, I don't know, maybe look like octopuses actually, but they engineer humanoid bodies so that they can better interact with us, and that those tools that they're using to engage us are like more approachable and relatable. Okay, well, that's an affirmation of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Then out of the other side of his mouth, Grusch will say something like, well, maybe the UFOs aren't objects at all as we understand objects in 4D space-time. Maybe they're like hyperdimensional objects, and UFOs are like shadows cast into a 4D space-time from a fifth-dimensional or hyperdimensional plane, right? And he very loosely references, quote, the holographic theory, unquote, in a way that's kind of like word salad physics, frankly. I know he has an undergraduate degree in physics, but I've studied the holographic universe theory, and it's not this the way that Grusch is presenting it in these podcasts. In other words, the hologram as an analogy to understand certain properties of quantum mechanics is not the kind of thing that he's bringing up. But in any case, if, let's say, a UFO were some kind of a hyperdimensional object and we perceive it in 4D space-time as, you know, one or another type of craft, right? But actually it's like, you know, it's like if we were two-dimensional beings and somebody put a pencil down on the flat plane that was our existence, to us it would be a circle, right? It would be just like the eraser, the flat end of the eraser head of the pencil. And we'd have no concept of the pencil as an object, because for us, the pencil would be something in a higher dimensional space beyond our understanding. So sometimes Grusch talks about UFOs like this. Well, which is it? Are they extraterrestrials, or is it a hyperdimensional object, right? And then he'll entertain the time travel hypothesis as well. You know, this guy, Michael Masters, anthropologist, he's written a couple of books now about UFOs as time machines, where, and I cited this, and, you know, Closer Encounters, one of the many lines of research I cited was this. And I actually picked a bone with Michael Masters because he subscribes to this closed time-like curve, CTC, theory of the way that space-time works, where it's impossible for time travelers to change the past. Anything that time travelers from the future do in the past sort of was already meant to happen and is part of a static and fixed logical matrix of space-time. Okay? So time travelers are not changing the past. They're just engaging in activities that were always meant to be part of a singular timeline, right? And I give him real grief over that. I deconstruct that view and propose an alternative where, in fact, it is possible to alter the timeline. And this is not an incidental point that I'm making. This is going to become actually very central to my critique of how disclosure is being handled. But point being, in other words, the idea of revising timelines and the implications of the fact that UFOs are flying time machines. But for the moment, my point is a third, thing that Grusch will say, a third view of the phenomenon that he will espouse. And by the way, can someone please tell David Grusch that espoused is not a word? He keeps saying this over and over again. What are you trying to say, man? Espoused, exposited, explicated?
He's like William Shakespeare. He just invents his new words that are going to go down in history.
That's right. They're going to,
yeah. But some of the things that he was...
I wouldn't be shocked if that happens. But anyway, point being, the third view that he espouses is this time travel. So first of all, he's got no clear... Look, even if he personally doesn't have a clear understanding of what this phenomenon is, if he is a front man for serious people inside Black projects, he should be coming forward with a more coherent picture than that as part of disseminating this information to the public.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. But some of the things that he was talking about were things that we were also discussing on Break the Rules. And in fact, if you guys go into the description, you're going to see I created a Jason Jorjani Break the Rules playlist. So you could see all of the previous Jason Jorjani videos there. But one of the things that I recall you were mentioning was how these entities, and right now we're not going to say like human, not human, these particular entities are able to travel in time, and they're also able to be, if I'm not mistaken, something akin to a fifth dimensional creature. Now, I don't know if that's exactly the right way to put it, but at least those 2 out of 3 seems to align with what you think is really going on here. And as far as the other stuff, I could attribute that to being trickery, as we were also talking about on the part of some of these encounters, whether it's some made-up to look like an alien meat sack, or whether it is like these other spectral entities that would mirror the things that human beings want to perceive them as. I don't know whichever one is actually going on here, but would you give some legitimacy to that at least 2 out of 3 he is right, even if it's accidentally?
Well, that accidentally makes a great deal of difference. Look, he's not in Closer Encounters, in my book Closer Encounters. I offer a theoretical synthesis which shows you how time travel is connected to hyperdimensional physics and what it means to reset timelines in a quantum computational cosmos. There's a coherent theorization going on, whether it's correct or not correct, okay? There's no theorization that's coherent of any kind behind Grusch's statements. I'll give you another example. And again, I don't, if David Grusch were like a private citizen, just pontificating on the phenomenon, that'd be one thing. But he is a front man for a group of Black project managers or operatives who have now thrown themselves in the middle of an active disclosure agenda that was being forwarded by another branch of the government, right? So which has thrown the whole situation into chaos. And that's not to mention that there's yet another group, which we're going to talk about, maybe more than one group actually, who don't want disclosure at all. And what I would like to, I have a rather clear idea of where I want to go with this, and what I'd like to come back around to is why I'm increasingly sympathetic to those people, because I see how the people who are handling disclosure don't know what the fuck they're doing. They are extremely irresponsible. Okay, so let me give you another example. Grusch, in some of these podcasts, has talked about the spiritual dimensions of the phenomenon. And in fact, I think he admitted at one point that when he was first being told some of this stuff, when he found out about the spiritual or consciousness-related aspects of these phenomena, it put him more at ease, and he found it actually more believable because it was consonant with his own layman's view of how the universe works, okay? And so he'll say things like, well, these entities have a kind of a higher consciousness, and they have spiritual abilities that are only latent in us. And, it looks like their minds have evolved beyond ours, just as their biology has. And that, we have certain latent abilities that you can see in a fully developed form in these beings. And it's quite possible that they've been involved throughout the spiritual history of mankind. Okay? Now, this brings us into two related issues that are deeply problematic. And one is psychic phenomena, and UFOs. And the other related question is UFOs and the religious history of humanity. Okay? So if you don't mind, we can go into each of these.
Let's do it.
Briefly, at least. So look, most contact reports beginning in the 1950s and extending all the way through, the abduction craze of the 80s and 90s feature accounts of these beings telepathically communicating with humans. Okay, whether it's the contactee phenomenon of people like George Adamski, George Van Tassel in the 1950s, or whether it's Whitley Strieber, and his abductions in the 1980s, or the cases studied by Bud Hopkins in the 80s and into the 90s. It's clear that these beings are telepathic. They have an incredibly powerful telepathic ability and clairvoyant ability, okay? And also there are instances of psychokinesis, of them being able to affect the physical world with mental intentionality. These are reported all throughout the abduction and contactee literature. All right, well, just stop for a minute to contemplate that. If you but let me add on top of that the fact that the people reverse engineering these UFOs have found that the craft themselves require psychic ability to operate. So, for example, there are some craft which you can't even get inside of without having psychic ability. The craft has no seam. It's seamless. It has no rivets. It has no door. You have to, and this, I'm reporting this is from a case in Italy where a craft was discovered in Italy, and they had to find this guy who had a very extraordinary psychic aptitude, and they brought him to interact with the craft to even get the damn thing open so they could investigate the inside of it. And It's only through focusing his mental intention that he was able to tell the craft to open a door, which then offered access to the interior of the vehicle. And what's worse is that the guidance systems of these craft appear to be, psychotronic. They have psychotronic guidance systems, which means you need to be an adept at psychokinesis to be able to operate these things. Well, this has led to the US deep state initiating a program where they identify children who are exceptionally gifted at psi ability. There are certain correlates to psi ability, ways that you can test for them without people realizing it's what you're screening them for in certain aptitude tests. And apparently the US government has these kinds of things, and they've been able to identify children that have this kind of aptitude, and mostly not in our country, because our citizens have some value to them, and they're going to be somewhat legally accountable, okay, for abducting American children. But they've done this predominantly in the third and fourth world, where life is cheaper. And they go and they buy these children from their families, offer the families a good standard of living, nice health care, promise to take care of the children. And they bring these gifted children to underground bases in the United States, and they train them to use their psi ability to pilot these craft. They now have double-digit numbers of these recovered craft, and so they've recruited a whole bunch of these children for decades now to pilot these craft. And so, okay, now just stop for a minute and think about the implications of that. That means that if disclosure takes place, you also have to disclose that extrasensory perception and psychokinesis are real. And the mainstream scientific establishment accepting that fact, and it being studied at all top research institutions, papers on it being published in all the top scientific journals, also means that eventually you're going to have widespread cultivation of these abilities, these latent abilities across the population, just the way that now you're starting to have private companies offer remote viewing training. Okay? So people will learn to increase their psychokinetic ability, their telepathic, clairvoyant ability, the way people learn a martial art. Now, what does that mean? It means a society where there's no privacy left at all, where any person can get inside any other person's mind, where a stranger can read not only your thoughts, but read your subconscious fears, desires, hidden motivations, right? A stranger can get inside your head like that. A perfect stranger can see what you're doing in the most private space. And by the way, this also means that there's no state secrecy anymore, because if clairvoyance is widely cultivated across the population, anyone who trains this ability, like you train a martial art, would be able to see what's going on inside of any classified facility anywhere, okay? Or to sit there, quote unquote, in an out-of-body experience, listening to a classified briefing. So forget state secrecy, okay? But you're not going to even have privacy inside your own home. Anyone can see what you're doing anywhere you are. What's even worse is, and by the way, some of this clairvoyant ability is inherently precognitive. Like when they were training the remote viewers in the Stanford Research Institute CIA program, they found that these remote viewers, remote viewing is a fancy term for clairvoyance. It's a certain clairvoyance protocol. They found that these remote viewers weren't giving them real-time data of what a certain classified Soviet facility was like. They were seeing that place in Siberia or in the Caucasus or whatever 200 years ago or 100 years into the future, okay? It happened often that the remote viewer's attention was drawn to that place when the most interesting or energetic event was taking place there, not necessarily in the present time frame, that the operators wanted intelligence about, right? So they had to train them how to navigate this slipping in time from precognition to retrocognition and so forth. In any case, clairvoyance is also precognition in some cases, and precognitive ability can be trained. Well, look, that means we can see crimes before they happen. How are you going to integrate that into our legal system if it becomes clear that there's a widely available ability to see rapes and murders before they happen? How are we going to stop that from being used to create a kind of criminal justice system that arrests people before they've committed a crime?
Well, we've seen what happened in Minority Report, and you were also talking about how Philip K. Dick had this kind of ability.
Yeah. And so, and that's not even comparable to the legal nightmare that would follow from mainstream scientific recognition of psychokinesis. Psychokinesis can be used for what they call direct mental interaction with living systems, DMILS, which is a fancy term for psychic healing, what they used to call faith healing. It's been done now in serious biology laboratories, consciousness studies and biology laboratories. And it turns out that you can diminish cancer, and you can, basically treat other ailments using visualization and focused intention. You can use the same visualization and focused intention to assassinate somebody by stopping their heart or causing them to have a stroke. The Soviets were working on this in the 1970s, as early as 1970s, into the 80s. In other words, the use of psychokinesis for remote assassination of targeted individuals. Now imagine the legal and political ramifications. Imagine as the sociologists call it, the social contagion and mass hysteria that would follow from a group of, a significant group of people, significant numbers of people developing this psychokinetic ability. And it's like sports ability or musical ability. Some people have an aptitude for it. Everyone can learn, but some people are exceptionally gifted. Imagine that large numbers of people start to develop this. What kind of a catastrophe this will be for the legal system when people start to bring accusations of so-and-so setting their house on fire out of spite, or so-and-so being the victim of psychic assassination. And then what are you going to do? You're going to bring in a psychic investigator to use, retrocognition to see the crime and see whether it was really this person who psychically intended to assassinate so-and-so. No, it's a nightmare. And you cannot have UFO disclosure without that nightmare. You cannot have UFO disclosure without that nightmare. Because psychic phenomena are absolutely integral, not just to the way that the UFO occupants, the way that these entities that we've been encountering live and the way they communicate. It's also integral to the functioning of the devices, of the craft themselves.
But would that not mean that if you were against this disclosure, that the way that we're living right now in this, very strange environment of being so culturally low while having all these secret projects going in the background, that the continuation of that would also possibly mean the degradation of humanity over time, as we have like this technology that helps us do certain things, but we're not really working on ourselves, kind of like in Mike Judge's Idiocracy.
First of all, I'm not against disclosure at all. That's not what I'm saying. Okay, I'm saying that it's being handled by irresponsible people who really have no idea what Pandora's box they're opening and have no vision of the day after. Or if they do have a vision of it, it's a very sinister vision, which I'm going to lay out, that has to do with the kind of creating a form of religious totalitarianism on the planet. Okay, but I'm not saying that, look, disclosure shouldn't take place, but it's a question of what kind of social transformation needs to happen as a precondition for disclosure. Let me give you another example. And this, again, has to do with certain things that Grusch will say now and then.
Oh, right. Before you give the other example, I just want to announce, because we have been receiving several super chats from the same person with many questions and all, or like the equivalent of $1 in India. I just want to make sure that everybody knows we have heightened the super chat minimum to $10. For the rest of the super chats, the other ones, they're grandfathered in, it's fine, but I just want to make sure that we don't get overwhelmed over here towards the end. So I really appreciate everybody. Once again, like, subscribe, so on. Go on, Jason.
So here's another really serious issue to consider. The propulsion, because what was I just talking about? I was talking about how integrating the psychic dimension of the UFO phenomenon in a post-disclosure world requires a maximal trust society, requires a kind of social fabric that we're not even close to having, that we can't even imagine having within this century, certainly. Okay? And let me just, as a sort of tangent, just point the following out, that it's not as if disclosure can take place at any time indefinitely into the future. Disclosure either has to take place in the next 20 years or it will never take place. I mean, not for another 10,000 years or, thousands of years. Why? Because we are fast approaching the technological singularity. There are convergent advancements in technological development, from genetic engineering to artificial intelligence to robotics to energy technology, which are converging on what's called the singularity. In other words, a point where technological progress is no longer exponential, it reaches a spike, okay? Or it represents a singularity in terms of the capacity to project from past developments into future developments, okay? The projective model breaks down at that point inside that singularity. And that singularity also represents the emergence of a form of intelligence that's beyond that of humanity. In other words, our human minds will no longer be able to wrap themselves around the kind of technological development that takes place beyond that point. Because then we're dealing with cybernetics, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and so on and so forth, right? Converging into something superhuman. Now, that technological singularity is at most 20 years away. At most, it may only be a decade away at the rate at which artificial intelligence is developing right now. And it's very clear from the role of secrecy and stealth in the UFO phenomenon itself. I'm not talking about the government right now. I'm talking about the stealth employed by the entities themselves, not just in modern times, but throughout the course of history, right? Secrecy is of the essence of how it is that they've been manipulating human affairs. And their ability to control us also depends on that secrecy. And there's no way we're going to reach the technological singularity with the kind of ubiquitous surveillance and data analysis that implies, and have these beings still be able to cloak themselves the way that they have thus far, okay? The artificial intelligence and the kind of signals analysis that we're developing right now will expose these entities. Will expose their craft constantly, will expose their any abductions that take place. They will not be able to operate clandestinely any longer if we reach the technological singularity. What's more significant is that the technological singularity means we achieve parity with them. Once you reach the technological singularity, you make more progress every year than in the last 100 years. You make more progress every few years than in the last 1,000 years, okay? And so this notion that somehow these beings are like millions of years more advanced than us, or hundreds, no, it's not like that. They're simply one step beyond us. We are at the threshold of the singularity. We're on one side of it, they're stepped on the other side of it. And their relationship to time and to history is completely different. It's not as if they're 10,000 years more advanced than us or several million years more advanced than us. It's that they're able to easily traverse millions of years of our linear history in a non-linear fashion using a hyperdimensional navigation system, okay? And we will have that technology once we reach the technological singularity. So, therefore, they will have to stop us from reaching the singularity within the next 10 to 20 years unless we disclose them before that, and unless we have a kind of socio-political structure that can successfully navigate both the ramifications of disclosure and the catastrophic implications of various singularity level technologies, from artificial intelligence to nanotechnology to cybernetics and gene splicing. Okay, so point being, if disclosure is going to take place at all, it's going to take place in the next 10 to 20 years. It has to take place in the next 10 to 20 years. Or we're going to have a reset, because what it means to stop the technological singularity isn't to like buy us another 100 years of time. No. Okay, to stop these convergent, exponentially advancing trajectories toward the singularity, you basically have to reset us to a feudal pre-industrial society. And these resets have happened before, okay? And by the way, the people who are, I mean, someone like Grusch will occasionally mention, something like this, because the operatives inside these black projects that he's talking to know this is the case, that there were resets in the past, like what we remember as the myth of Atlantis, or the destruction of the civilization that was devastated by the flood of Noah, right, in the Bible. And so these resets have taken place before, and unless we get our shit together in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to go through another reset. And, God only knows, or the devil does, when we'll be at this point again in the future, however many centuries into the future.
But what I don't understand here is that if these beings are so powerful that they have the ability to go back in time and change things around, then why do we assume that we have any ability to control it at all? If they notice that, like in this amount of time, they're going to try something, then they can nip it in the bud whenever they want to. Isn't that the case?
No, because these beings, there's no these beings. And this is another basic, fundamental misunderstanding involved in all of this. There's no such thing as these beings. This is all about mankind. All of it. It's about evolution and the future of humanity. That's what this is about. So we're not dealing with alien, and by the way, this is another extremely deceptive use of language. Non-human intelligence. What is this bullshit that they're peddling about NHI, non-human intelligence? And they'll even sometimes in some of these conversations, whether it's Michael Masters, who has these theses about time travel, or whether it's Grusch or others involved in this initiative, will often mention in the same sentence, within the same thought, that these are time-traveling humans from the future, and then they'll call them non-human intelligence. What the fuck is going on here? This is a deliberate deception that's being promulgated with certain terminology. Why? Because to consider that the beings who've been manipulating us for all of our history on the other side of this phenomenon are not alien, but other humans, is even more disturbing to us than to imagine that they're aliens. And moreover, and this is even more sinister, by calling them non-human intelligence, you leave the door open to the conception of them as angels, to people being able to conceive of them as angels or as demons. And this is another aspect of the discourse that we see emerging these days, where you have, from out of the Jesuit order in the Vatican, an agenda being unfolded to portray these entities as angelic beings, or in some cases where the behavior of the entities is questionable from the standard of criteria that the church is using, as demonic beings, right? So non-human intelligence can also mean, they're on another plane above us, as in they're divine beings. And Ross Coulthart, who did that first interview with Grusch, I liked his attitude. I liked the way he handled that interview. But then I listened to some more podcasts of his, including a conversation he had with that guy who wrote The Hunt for Zero Point, Nick Cook, who exposed the 1940s German anti-gravity research and how it was furthered in aerospace companies in America in the 1950s. Ross Coulthart was talking with that guy, Nick Cook. And the conversation went to a place where Coulthart started saying things like, maybe we're just not ready. Maybe there are things that we're just not supposed to know. That these advanced beings are emotionally, spiritually developed. They have a certain level of wisdom that makes it such that they can be privy to this kind of knowledge, but this knowledge should remain hidden from us, and we're just not ready yet, right? And he repeated this kind of thing a few times. And it's very consonant with what's coming from out of people who are aligned with the Vatican's disclosure agenda, okay? Where these entities are being portrayed as higher divine beings, and that in order for disclosure to happen, we need to come back into some kind of a divine hierarchy where we understand our proper place in the universe, And this knowledge is not going to be shared with us. We may be taken care of and we may be guided using these types of technology. Like, for example, 0-point energy might be used to end hunger and poverty on the earth, but we won't be able to handle that technology. It'll be sequestered from us, right? And there'll be certain conditions on ending disease and poverty and hunger and so forth, right? And ultimately, it has to do with us accepting the putatively beneficent guidance of these divine beings, whether you want to call them angels or you want to call them gods, as the Hindus do, right? There is a discourse that's being unfolded that is promoting a kind of perennialist unity of world religions and a reestablishment of a divine hierarchy that prevents humans from being able to access and handle the kind of technology behind the UFO phenomenon, at the same time as humans accept the entities behind this phenomenon as divine guides or guardians. And this is what I find to be most disturbing about, the various disclosure discussions that are taking place now.
Very interesting. Would you prefer to go into this as far as what exactly is in the background of these spiritual technologies, or more in terms of history? Because Grusch was talking about how Mussolini's Italy were the ones that, while not the first he was willing to admit being the ones to discover a UFO flying saucer craft. So which one of these two would you want to start with first?
Neither. I want to go there. But before we go off into, theology and into the religious history of humanity, or what kinds of political forces from Mussolini's time and onward have been managing the information regarding this phenomenon, I want to sharpen the security questions and the sociological questions around disclosure a little bit more. Okay. So where I was going when I was, when I broached the subject of the technological singularity is toward pointing out how catastrophic the disclosure of certain aspects of the UFO phenomenon are. And we talked about the psychic dimension. But of course, at the center, literally, of the whole thing is the propulsion system, right? I mean, what is it that makes a UFO do the things that it does? And what that is a 0-point energy device. So 0 point refers to the Planck length, named after the physicist Max Planck. And it is basically the smallest measurable volume metric of space-time. Okay. And it is a scale. So for example, to give an analogy, in atomic energy, we get a tremendous amount of power, nuclear power, from the atomic level, from a very, very small scale, from the atomic scale of uranium or plutonium inside of a reactor, right? So a tremendous amount of energy is being tapped from a very small scale, namely the atomic scale. What a 0-point energy device does, which is a device that involves, various isotopes, like isotopes of mercury and thorium, and it involves counter-rotating electromagnetic fields. And what this device does is it taps an even more tremendous amount of energy from a much smaller scale, an even smaller scale than the atomic, namely the scale of the Planck length. And at that, if you can access energy at that scale, you're basically tapping into the background energy of the cosmos by opening up a controlled singularity. It's like creating a mini black hole, basically, okay, and using the energy from it. And now, another thing Grusch will say, and by the way, Stephen Greer also loves to use this analogy. Stephen Greer, the civilian advocate of disclosure now for decades, he loves to use this analogy, and Grusch has also used it recently. the analogy between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons on the one hand, and zero-point energy and the weaponization of ZPE on the other hand. And I want to show you why this is a terrible disanalogy. And it really demonstrates, it's another thing that demonstrates that these gentlemen have no idea what they're doing. And they're being extremely reckless. So, yeah, nuclear power is widely disseminated. Many countries have nuclear power plants. And nuclear physics is a public knowledge base, which is taught in any decent university, right? And so Grusch and Greer will say things like, well, we should make the physics of this public. And by the way, we've had the physics of this since the 50s. The classified world has. And not only has it been deliberately hidden, quantum gravity has been hidden also through an active disinformation campaign that's involved con jobs like string theory. They created things like string theory. Ed Witten deliberately came out and disseminated these things so that all the physics funding would be focused on this nonsense, and it would distract people, divert them from developing quantum gravity. Why? Now, why? I have sympathy for these people who did this, because they're very concerned about the weapons implications of this technology. All right, so think about it. It's true, nuclear energy and nuclear physics are public knowledge, but nuclear weapons are tightly controlled. We have regulations against countries developing nuclear weapons, which are policed by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And we have ways of investigating whether people are developing nuclear weapons. And so Grusch and Greer say, okay, well, we can do the same thing with ZPE. We'll make the physics public. We'll make the energy technology widely available. Everyone will have their ZPE power cell, like a propane tank in their backyard, or actually it's even smaller than a propane tank. You literally can have one of these things the size of a coffee cup and put it inside of the hood of your car, and you'll have a Jetsons car. It'll be an anti-gravity flying car, right? And so these power cells should be widely available, and they will end poverty and hunger and starvation in the world by creating an economy of abundance and so on and so forth. All right, this is the discourse. And they say, well, we can prevent weaponization of it the same way that we keep nuclear bomb designs secret. You know, nuclear weapons designs are classified, and we monitor to make sure that, you know, there aren't industrial efforts at the manufacture of nuclear weapons. Look, to build nuclear weapons, you need a massive industrial apparatus. Only very advanced industrial countries have the capability to manufacture nuclear weapons. For one, you need like a vast array of gas centrifuges, or you need laser isotope enrichment technology. You need to be able to take this mined ore and process it on a large industrial scale. Also, manufacturing the other components of an atomic bomb are not easy, especially the precision precision munitions and so on and so forth used. It requires the resources of a nation state to build nuclear weapons. Moreover, we have satellites in space that can detect the radiological signature of a nuclear weapon. So we know when a country's developed a nuclear weapon. This is why countries like Japan and Iran, who secretly already have nuclear weapons, keep their nuclear weapons disassembled. They have all the components, but they don't put them together, and they can do so very quickly, but they don't put them together because they'll be detected. And also, if a country, you know, really wants to seriously develop nuclear weapons, they have to at least test the weapon once to know that their design is accurate, right? I mean, like even the Israelis didn't have a place to test their weapon, so they tested it with South Africa off the coast of South Africa in the Vela test in 1979. Even Israel has tested a nuclear weapon secretly. I was about to say secretly, right? But actually, it's not a secret at all. Anytime a country tests a nuclear weapon, a seismograph halfway across the planet will detect it. It has a very unique signature. So point being, it's not easy to hide nuclear weapons development. That's a total disanalogy to ZPE. The way these zero-point energy devices are constructed and the way they work is such that you could take one from your backyard or the hood of your car into your garage, and together with the trusty robot, your all-purpose robot that everyone will have by 2030, because we're also on the brink of a robotics revolution. I mean, they have them now. They're just very expensive. Together with your trusty robot and a hacked AI system whose safeguards have been taken down, you will have all the assistance you need in turning this coffee cup-sized ZPE device into a bomb capable of vaporizing all of Earth's oceans. Okay, that's not a random example I'm giving. Hal Puthoff, who spent decades researching zero-point energy technology and who was one of the scientists with the security clearances working at the Stanford Research Institute to develop remote viewing. Puthoff, who's a physicist, background naval intelligence and other black projects and so on and so forth, he has gone on record saying, I believe it was in Nick Cook's book, The Hunt for Zero Point, that a coffee cup sized device, if detonated, if jerry rigged into a weapon and detonated, would have enough energy to vaporize all of Earth's oceans. Okay, or to extend the example, blow up a whole continent. So excuse me, wait a minute. You are going to release this technology into the public sphere so that any Tom, Dick, and Harry terrorist can go turn one of these power cells into a bomb that can blow up a whole continent? I mean, what kind of idiocy is that? And the fact that someone like Grusch or Greer, despite Greer being involved for decades with these various people who've come from out of black programs and discussed these things with him, the level of irresponsibility of advocating that kind of a release of technology without the social and political preconditions being in place, it just boggles the mind to me. And it suggests to me, again, that these guys don't know what they're doing. And potentially their haphazard, irresponsible behavior is going to be capitalized on by forces that want no disclosure at all, or forces that want some kind of a reset that's going to be responsible for the regression of humanity.
A great reset, perhaps. But when we're talking about this technology, you were also mentioning the ability to be fifth dimensional and to change the future and all of that stuff. So by that time of, as you call it, the spectral revolution, wouldn't there also be people that would know, hey, like George Jetson is going to be using his robot Lucy to construct a bomb capable of destroying the Earth's ocean. We better stop him before he gets the idea to do this enough ahead of time.
Yeah. And they won't stop just George Jetson or Lex Luthor or Osama bin Laden powered by ZPE technology. They will stop all of us, because there's going to be 1,000, George Jetsons or what, but he's a terrible example. George Jetson schmuck's not going to do it. But look, Hamas terrorists or whatever, right? So people with that mentality, they're all over the place. Timothy McVeigh, they're all over the place. We live in a world full of religious and political divisions, an ideologically torn planet where everyone is using terrorism to further their cause, whether it's the Irish Republican Army or, and Hamas or wherever, your sympathies may lie, right? We live in a world full of terrorism. And this is not a technology that even, let's suppose for a moment that Grusch and Greer were right to draw the analogy to nuclear energy versus nuclear weapons. What about North Korea? What about Pakistan? Do you really want the 0-point energy equivalent of a nuclear North Korea or a nuclear Pakistan? Do we want Saudi Arabia having 0-point energy technology? Because they will, if you disclose this, they will. And I don't want the people who govern Mecca to have 0-point energy technology. No, thank you. First of all, I don't want them flying to Mars in it. Second of all, I don't want them weaponizing it. And we talk about nuclear blackmail today. Imagine 0-point energy blackmail wielded by an Islamic caliphate that has a demographic majority on the face of the earth by 2070. Okay? That is not a world that we can live in. So, would they see that coming? Yes, absolutely. People with hyperdimensional technology would see that coming. And not only would they stop any individual actors, they'll pull the plug on our whole advancement towards it. In other words, they will reset us so that first of all, we don't continue to approach the technological singularity, but also so that no real UFO disclosure takes place. and the phenomenon is able to retain its element of stealth. And we go through another freaking dark ages, another medieval epoch of barbarism and mass retardation, which is the direction we're headed in right now. And so, look, and that brings us to another aspect of this, which we broached earlier, and maybe you want to go there now, and that's the religious dimension, to talk more explicitly about theology, which is what made the Middle Ages in Europe such a miserable time.
Well, going into theology here, if we're talking about these hyperdimensional humans, I'm not going to call them beings anymore, being able to stop people from doing stupid things, terroristic activities, then if we assume that they're the ones who also controlled the timeline so as to enable these religions to be there in the first place, in a way it seems like they're creating their own problems, and there could have been a different way to go about it maybe. But if we pretend for a second there, like, forget about, what their motivation may be, let's say that you, Jason Risa Jorjani, was transported back in time and you were in charge of having like a Prometheus religion or something to basically get people out of that state. Would you do anything differently than these entities did in order to, make the best possible scenario happen?
Sure, I would. But let's approach that slowly and carefully. So you said a bunch of different things there that are relevant that I want to expand on. One is you opened in with saying, okay, let's not call them entities anymore. Let's call them these humans, these time travelers.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Prometheus.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that brings us to, which is integral to the religious question, in terms of Genesis, in terms of the idea of the creation of man by God or the gods, right, and all this, is the myth of Prometheus, and its relationship to this phenomenon. Because, see, another aspect of sociopolitical catastrophe unfolding as a result of disclosure is an aspect that has to do with genetic engineering and the creation and directed evolution of mankind. Okay? So Grusch mentioned that some of these individuals who've briefed him are involved with the study of, as he put it, non-human biologistics. In other words, putatively alien biological material. And now there's also this researcher, Gary Nolan, who, at least to my knowledge, is not part of one of these black projects, but in a more semi-public manner is investigating the genetics of some of this, or at least materials analysis, okay? Whether it's metallurgical analysis or biological analysis of remains that have been, discovered. So look, human versus non-human. Clearly, the beings behind this phenomenon have mastered genetic engineering to where they can recode the human genome in any way that they want, and they're capable of producing basically a plethora of drones who act as biological robots that do their bidding. So these grays, these little gray entities that we see, who seem to be sexless, they, according to some of the autopsy reports that have leaked, they have no digestive system. They appear to be cloned biological robots, drones of a kind. And so another aspect of disclosure is not just, the physics know-how behind zero-point energy. It's also the biotech behind being able to roll grays off an assembly line, right? If disclosure takes place, now granted, our own biotechnology is advancing at an exponential rate, and it's one of the convergent trajectories into the technological singularity. I mean, CRISPR is pretty impressive in terms of what it can do with the human genome, right? And especially then if you add how artificial intelligence can sequence the genome so that you know the secondary and tertiary functions of certain genes, so you don't go dicking around trying to change one, genotype or one phenotypic expression of a genotype and then wind up like accidentally getting rid of a certain disease resistance, right? When you combine AI with the kind of CRISPR gene editing technology we have now, it's already very impressive. But if you were to have full UFO disclosure, it's also a disclosure of what we've been able to reverse engineer of the biotechnology that they're using to engineer these grays, okay, that they use to carry out abductions and so forth. Now, this brings us to the myth of Prometheus. So Prometheus is the genetic engineer of humanity. And Ridley Scott made a lot out of this in his Prometheus films, right? In 2012 film Prometheus, and then the sequel, Alien Covenant. They were brilliant extrapolations from out of the aspects of the Prometheus myth that have to do with Prometheus being the genetic engineer of humanity. And what's at the heart of the Prometheus myth is a struggle over the purpose of human life and the destiny of mankind. And you see an earlier version of this, a version earlier than the Greek version, in Sumerian mythology, in the conflict between Enki and Enlil, where Enki is like the Prometheus figure, and actually Enki engineered humanity, but Enlil wants humanity to be a race of slaves, like Zeus does, right, in the Prometheus myth. And so you have this sort of beneficent, not a god, because Prometheus is a titan, but beneficent deity who's a champion of humanity and wants to empower his children and wants to give them the gift of science and the power of technological development, which is symbolized by the fire stolen from Olympus, the fire of the forge that brings the light of science into a benighted world. And you have Zeus or Enlil or Yahweh or whatever, Jupiter, who wants to keep humanity in enforced ignorance, in a state of servility and stupidity, right? So that we can be basically a slave race, serving these gods as part of their anointed divine hierarchy. And the perfect example of that divine hierarchy is the caste system of ancient India, with the Devas at the top and the Brahmins helping to enforce the rule of the Devas, and then various castes of workers all the way down to the masses of untouchables. Go ahead.
Well, doesn't that make their job a little harder, like I was asking in the beginning? If you're creating these people who are probably going to become terrorists in the future, and you also know that humanity is going in this trajectory of creating something that's liable to destroy the entire Earth, then it seems like you're taking kind of a chance on making them all stupider as opposed to making them all as smart as they can be.
No, the point is that as Zarathustra understood well when he composed the Gathas something like 2,700 years ago, there are two fundamental forces struggling with one another over the relative evolution or regression of humanity. One is a force of progress and innovation. He called it sepantominu, the progressive mentality. To translate it into Greek, you would get Prometheia, the defining quality of Prometheus. And then on the other hand, you have what Zarathustra called engraminu, or contracted into ahriman, which means the regressive, constraining, or retarding mentality. Okay? And so you have these two dialectical forces at work with one another as a kind of, I don't want to use the word mechanism, as a kind of, intrinsic to the evolutionary process, right? And the devas, or angels, or whatever, the enforcers of the divine will, which Zarathustra preaches against in the Gathas. He says they're deceivers and manipulators who are sadistic, and they're basically, Zarathustra's understanding of these beings became foundational for the Gnostic conception of archons later. The problem with Gnosticism is the way in which it whitewashes Jesus and tries to make it seem as if Jesus was opposed to these archons, when in fact, throughout the Gospels, Jesus clearly says that he is the son of Yahweh and in the world at the behest of Yahweh, and there to complete the mission of the Jewish prophets who served Yahweh, and that, you know, the angels are his servants, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the Gnostics, they're involved in a kind of cognitive dissonance, which, by the way, I analyzed this psychologically and sociologically in depth in chapter 6 of Closer Encounters, how Gnosticism in particular involves a kind of Stockholm syndrome and cognitive dissonance, similar to what you see in Sufism in an Islamic context. In any case, you have the devas, or the angels, serving this force of constraint and regression that wants to keep humanity in a position of servility, where, you know, we're sinful and we shouldn't have excessive pride to think that we can be the masters of our own destiny, and we should accept divine guidance and divine grace and hope for salvation from our sinful nature and all this, right? And, you know, you can have the Hindu version of it, where, you know, how you have karma and reincarnation, and they're told that, like, if they dutifully serve as chandalas, or they dutifully serve as, you know, as workers, as banaras, or as a kshatriya, a good soldier, for like a lifetime without questioning their proper social responsibility, they may aspire to be reborn into a higher caste. And maybe someday, ultimately, after millennia, your soul might evolve to be that of a god, right? You have the Hindu version, or you have the Catholic version, where there's hell and there's purgatory and there's heaven. And most people go to purgatory. And, you know, you just have to hope for divine grace to offer you guidance, you know, to basically overcome your sinful nature and ultimately be accepted, you know, into the mansions that are waiting for you in heaven, right? Now, look, some of us might think this is laughable, but it's unfortunately not to the vast majority of people in the world who continue to subscribe to one or another retarded belief system of this kind, whether it's Catholicism or other forms of Christianity, or whether it's Hinduism. And what I find most alarming about the current disclosure initiative is the way in which these institutions, these religious institutions, are attempting to monopolize the discourse. Let me give you a particularly egregious example. And I have not talked about this thus far because, frankly, I didn't want to draw any more attention to this person. But, you know, there's a red line somewhere. So Diana Pasulka is a professor of religion who is a professed Catholic and who has access to the Vatican secret library, apparently has a very warm relationship with the Vatican. And from her first book in 2019, American Cosmic, to her recent book, very originally titled Encounters, it's become clear that she's on point for the Vatican disclosure agenda. Whether it's unwittingly or deliberately, clearly the Vatican, and I think in particular the Jesuit order, has chosen her as basically a face and voice for the Vatican discourse over disclosure and the Vatican handling of information regarding UFOs and close encounters. And when I was horrified when I read American Cosmic, because a whole line of argument involving Heidegger, technology and the spectral, and even the myth of Prometheus in the context of the religious history of man in general.
Sounds like a fan of yours.
Heidegger, technology, the spectral, and Prometheus all come up in this book with no reference to me at all. However, Diana Pasulka's two main sources for her research, the two people who turned her on to this phenomena, she admits she had no clue about UFOs even, 6-7 years ago, completely dismissed the subject, was a scholar of Catholicism. And who turned her on to this subject? None other than Jeffrey Kripal, one of the readers of my dissertation, one of the people who endorsed Prometheus and Atlas, and Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée, who read Prometheus and Atlas when it came out, and who in early 2017, invited me to his home for a very nice dinner where we had a long conversation about the subject. Well, Pasulka's book comes out a couple years after my interactions with Jacques Vallée, and she has extensive passages in this book where Jacques Vallée is telling her about Heidegger and technology and the spectral, and she also brings up the myth of Prometheus. Pasulka's also admitted that she first began to contemplate this subject in 2011 in the context of conversations with Jeffrey Kripal. What was Jeffrey Kripal doing in 2011? He was reading the dissertation version of Prometheus and Atlas. Someone confronted Pasulka about this, I won't say who, and asked whether she knew my work, because clearly she was using my work. She was appropriating my ideas. And what's worse, misappropriating them to serve the Vatican agenda. In other words, using the myth of Prometheus in a way that ultimately valorizes Catholicism and validates Christianity. And I had people, when I first came out with Prometheus and Atlas, I had people approach me and ask me to do the same thing, by the way. They said, oh, just say that Christ is a Promethean figure. Just say that Prometheus was a precursor of Christ. And, find some way, some like Steinerian way to synthesize Prometheus with Christianity. Well, this is what Pasulka is doing. She just came out 2 weeks ago at a conference at Stanford University where Jacques Vallée was sitting there at the table. She came out with a paper called Rewriting the Myth of Prometheus, where she basically advances the thesis that the myth of Prometheus is the key to understanding the close encounter phenomenon. Okay? No reference to me, no citation, nothing. So my work is being actively misappropriated in order to serve the agenda of my adversaries. And now, Pasulka is a useful idiot. Okay, she's a useful. Go listen to her podcasts. Who I really hold responsible for this situation are people who should know better, like Jacques Vallée and Jeffrey Kripal. Why is Jacques Vallée he put a very nice endorsement on Pasulka's new book, right? As of course, so did Jeffrey Kripal. Now, Kripal has a background in religious studies. He comes from the Catholic faith himself originally. At one point, Kripal was even studying to be a monk before he formally left Catholicism, right? But so he was, he has that Catholic boy background, okay? Like the good Catholic girl, altar girl Pasulka, okay? And so I can see psychologically where there might be some subconscious motivations there, but Jacques Vallée really, with the kind of scientific and technical background that he has, and having written books like Passport to Magonia and The Invisible College, which do engage in a somewhat sophisticated way with the religious history of mankind and with how the phenomenon may have been responsible even for dark ages and for negative manipulations of
or talking about like the Virgin Mary sightings being in the same places where they were seeing other goddesses before Christianity. So yeah, like I agree, he should know.
Fatima, like Vallée writes about the Fatima encounter in the early 20th century. So why would Vallée endorse this kind of discourse? Look, when I had dinner with him, I asked him, why is it that because I was already, I had already written about UFOs and religion in Prometheus and Atlas in 2016. I mean, it was published in 2016. I wrote it in 2011. And I had already written about UFOs and religion, and I was already doing the research that led ultimately to like 100 pages on UFOs and religion in Closer Encounters. And I said, and see, in this book, in Closer Encounters, I go into the details of episodes in the history of various religions that seem to be ancient accounts of close encounters. I go into the details, including the social and political context. Okay, like for example, people talk about the 10 commandments. There weren't 10 commandments. There were never 10 commandments. There's a shit ton of commandments. and they begin in Exodus and they continue through Leviticus and Deuteronomy and so on and so forth. Moses came out of that object, and it was an object. It's described very clearly. It was a cylindrical UFO that electrogravitically parted the Red Sea, landed on Mount Sinai. Moses goes inside of it, and he comes out of it with these commandments. These commandments include an entire legal system, which became the foundation for Orthodox Jewish law. And it's an incredibly regressive, retarded, oppressive legal system that includes, among other things, the institutionalization of slavery and the oppression of women, okay? As mandated by Yahweh and the other Elohim, the other gods. So there's a context here, right? There's a socio-political context to this close encounter. It's not value neutral. It's not like, some Jews, some Hebrews out in the desert saw some things and they misinterpreted according to like the archetypes in their
smoked the acacia tree and saw like a vision of God and all that, because that's a lot of like the Burning Man people. They attribute the acacia tree psychedelics to a lot of these religious visions.
Yeah, no, not like that. So when Joshua is leading the campaign to conquer Jericho, and basically as part of the Israelite conquest of Canaan, which has been promised to them by Yahweh as their promised land, it very clearly describes how Adonai Elohim, the chief of the gods, is coordinating with Joshua and sends a commander as a liaison, and how the Ark of the Covenant is used as a technological device to bring down the walls of, first to let them cross the Jordan, and then to bring down the walls of Jericho using some kind of a sonic resonance. And what happens in Jericho? It's a genocide. Not only do they kill all the people, they kill all the animals. Okay, and basically they just loot the gold and whatever, the material assets that can be retrieved from the city. It's a genocide and part of a genocidal campaign in Canaan in general. So there's a socio-political context here. And I asked Jacques about this at dinner that night, and because he likes to talk about fairies and sylphs and
who doesn't?
All these various beings that medieval people, that ancient Celtic people saw. And now and then he'll also mention the Bible and encounters in the Bible, like Ezekiel. He'll talk about the wheels of Ezekiel and all that. But he never gets into the details of these close encounter reports in ancient texts in context. Why? I asked him. And he was like, well, you have to be very careful not to offend people's religious sensibilities. We don't want to stigmatize certain religions and things and whatever, So basically it was a very social justice warrior kind of a response, ahead of the curve, that we have to be careful not to basically stigmatize religious belief systems by suggesting that they were engineered as part of a nefarious, even sadistic control mechanism, right? Which is why he'll focus on Anunnaki or on elves and fairies and what? Because they're parts of dead religions. They don't involve living religions like Christianity and Islam that still have billions of followers, right? And so now it's gone to the level where he's not just avoiding that discussion, he's actually endorsing the Vatican's appointed agent of disclosure, Diana Pasulka, who has misappropriated the discourse of Prometheus from my work very explicitly, including discussions of Heidegger and technology and so forth, that were regurgitated to her by the likes of Vallée and Kripal, who, by the way, admitted themselves to me when I was engaging with them that they couldn't make heads or tails out of Heidegger. So how is it that suddenly they're explaining Heidegger to Diana Pasulka? Anyway, that's where we're at. And it's made me very cynical about the entire disclosure process to see what kinds of people have become the gatekeepers of it and what kind of discourse is being forwarded.
Very interesting. I don't even know where to begin over here, Jason, because we have also examples of the primal Hebrews worshiping these, fertility gods, and Yahweh as being like this sky father tribal god, things of that nature. And I'm not necessarily sure where exactly to place this idea of a much more technologically advanced being
It's
here.
not difficult. You ever watch some of these old episodes of the original series of Star Trek? It's not difficult. Okay. So you have these people, they worship their tribal gods. They're like, worshiping totems and whatever. And the totem has a name, it has an idea behind it. And these entities come down, they say, hey, I'm so and so. So they hack the belief system of the tribe. They basically use archetypes in the collective unconscious of a particular culture in order to exercise control over that culture and redirect its history. That's how it's done. And it's been done over and over again, basically in every major civilization on the earth.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to something like Hinduism, you also have, like we were talking before, somebody like Indra being the same as Yahweh, being the same as Zeus. Are we necessarily talking about different beings, or are we talking about the same being,
It
literally the
doesn't
same
matter.
one?
It
doesn't
doesn't matter. What matters is this: what ethos do we need to adopt and embody in order to successfully navigate both the technological singularity and the ramifications of full UFO disclosure? What ethos? And where does that ethos stand with regard to the basic structure of the dominant religious belief systems on the planet? So if you study Christianity, and I used to teach comparative religion for a while, when you study Judeo-Christianity in all its forms, from Catholicism to evangelical Christianity, various forms of Protestantism, or you study the various sects of Islam or Hinduism, and here I mean, when I say Hinduism, of course, any scholar of religion will know there's no such thing as Hinduism. There's a plethora of Indian religions, but when I say Hinduism, what I mean is Vedic religion, the religion that holds the Vedas as sacred texts, okay? The Rig Veda, the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, etc. So not some like obscure tantric sects in Bengal, like the Thugis and so on and so forth, who I love some of those sects and whatever. But the truth is that they're not just marginal in India, they're extremely marginalized. I mean, they're considered the dregs of society.
Like the Agoris.
Yeah, they're totally persecuted in their own country in the context of the Vedic belief system of Hindu India, right? So, but if my point is this, if you look at the large scale belief systems on the planet, Islam, Christianity, Vedanta, even Confucianism with its conception of the celestial ancestors and the very paternalistic attitude that it has vis-a-vis elders and sagacious fatherly guides and proper social roles, and a discipline that follows from a mandate of heaven, right? Even Confucianism to an extent. When you look at all these major belief systems, none of them are consonant with a Promethean ethos devoted to the cultivation of individual creativity, innovation, and bold and intrepid discovery and exploration. None of them are. In fact, they are diametrically opposed to it, which should be no surprise, because if you look at the structure of the myth of Prometheus, Prometheus is a rebel against an existing divine hierarchy. And you can map that structure of the Promethean myth onto any number of other religions, right? Where Prometheus, and this is what they did, they came around me, all these people, when I came out with Prometheus and Atlas, and said, don't say this. You just don't say, and you can go, there's a path, there's a racket. You want to come into the racket? Just don't say he's an avatar of the same God who brought Jesus, right? No, what they didn't want me to say, and which is very obvious if you study theology like 101, is that the myth of Prometheus maps onto the Abrahamic religions in a way where Prometheus is Satan, very clearly. Prometheus is the satanic entity who offers humanity knowledge in Eden, and Prometheus is the dragon at the apocalypse who fights with Michael and with the angels of the Lord, okay? So the ethos that we need to embody, the ethos that you see throughout the science fiction of modernity, from Shelley's Frankenstein onward through, Asimov's Foundation, this Promethean ethos that expresses itself in a new form of spirituality in the context of our science fiction visions, is an ethos diametrically opposed to that of the dominant world religions like Catholicism, on behalf of which someone like Diana Pasulka is abducting and perverting the Promethean myth. Okay? So the worst form of psychological warfare is taking place here. It's funny, when I started Prometheism, and I wrote the opening lines, both of the Prometheus Manifesto and my book Prometheism, as, quote, "This is a declaration of war," unquote. These people came out and called me a warmonger. But actually, they're the ones who are engaging in the worst form of psychological warfare imaginable. Perverting ideas, misappropriating them, twisting them, in order to preserve and maintain and safeguard a hierarchical, paternalistic, oppressive control system on this planet. Okay, so I want to see UFO disclosure unfold in a way that breaks that control system. I want to see UFO disclosure become an actualization of the myth of Prometheus unbound, of Prometheus being unbound by Heracles, right? Who kills the eagle of Zeus and so forth. The proper ending of the Promethean myth, meaning the dethroning of Zeus, or the victory of Satan over God.
Now, when it comes to the future, we're going to get to that as well, because you were mentioning apocalypse. But another thing that I'm interested in finding out here is when we take a look at what ended up happening with these revealed Abrahamic religions, it seems like a lot of Jews, like the OGs who had it, they ended up within their religion kind of almost fighting against God in the way. Even the word Israel means to wrestle with God. And it's pretty common even to see like some rabbis like cursing God and, arguing with God and stuff like that, which may have contributed to a lot of Jews also ending up being atheists, which again, I think is kind of a midwit position at the end of the day, where they don't consider the other things that we've talked about here. But as far as denying the power of this all-knowing entity to control their lives, I think at least among some Jews we've been seeing a kind of a Promethean pushback against that. But at the same time, we've also had Christianity and we've also had Islam. And as I was mentioning that time we met in New York City a couple of days ago, that if you were to take a look at even the designs of like how do you create a certain religious system here, you would have these towers, these minarets that I could see being almost like one of these real-time strategy games where you would place a minaret within a certain location so that its radius would encompass a certain amount of people that would hear the call to prayer. And it seems like a very top-down type of design. And I could also see a similar thing happening in Judaism and Christianity, but I was wondering if you could talk about, from the perspective of these human beings that would have created these religions, let's say, how exactly they've designed these things to work, and are they working according to those designs, or like in the case of Judaism that I mentioned, has it diverted away from their original intention, and is that why they, did some things after that?
That's why I love Jews. So let me explain something rather subtle about Judaism. I look, there's an esoteric dimension of my work. I have an exoteric facade to my writing, and like any deep thinker, like beginning with Plato, there's an esoteric dimension of my work. And you can see it very clearly in texts like Iranian Leviathan, that there's an esoteric message there. And in Iranian Leviathan in particular, I talk about how Mithraic magi in the Achaemenid Persian Empire reshaped Judaism, and the way in which the ancient Persian state was responsible for the first Zionist project in history, namely the reconstitution of the state of Israel and the reconstruction of the Temple of Solomon, during the reigns of Cyrus, and well, Cyrus commissioned it, but more so during the reign of Darius, at cost to the Persian treasury, right? But the important dimension is the religious dimension. And I go into the book of Job in particular, which was written in the Achaemenid period. And I have a deep analysis of Job. Remember, the book is called Iranian Leviathan, like the Leviathan from the book of Job, where Satan makes an appearance and so on and so forth. And long story short, what I argue is that the Jewish Bible was reshaped in a way, rewritten, okay, in a manner that was intended to catalyze satanic rebellion. That the purpose of the Tanakh, in the form in which it emerged in the Achaemenid period, under the guidance of Mithraic Magi working with Kohanim, the purpose was actually, over the long run, to disillusion people from faith in God and sow the seeds of atheism, revolution, and rebellion. And this worked among Jews. It worked among Jews. And so for the same reason that often you'll hear these right-wing reactionaries say that Jews are at the bottom of every revolution and of every degenerate, every degenerate unraveling of traditional belief system, for the very same reason I love Jews. And I think, in effect, it's an immune response. You see, the Tanakh was an inoculant. It was meant to depict the way in which the ancient Israelite religion was reshaped by Kohanim under the guidance of Mithraic Magi, was meant to depict Yahweh as a tyrannical overlord in such grotesque terms that would put you off belief in God in general, and that would make you question the very idea of divine hierarchy. It's as if a trickster came and said to the Devas, these ninnies in your caste system don't worship you because of your complex ontotheology, because of, I will not call it philosophy, because of the ontotheology in the Upanishads. That's not why the majority of Hindus agree to live in the caste system. You're not convincing them, you're not prevailing over their reason. They believe in you because they're terrified and they're pathetic and they're servile. And I'm going to show you that that's the case by putting the scarecrow up here as a totem, and they'll even worship this shit. Watch. And meanwhile, Satan is set up as a hero. The serpent in Eden, the dragon of the apocalypse, is set up as an antagonist throughout the course of the Tanakh. And the book of Job is a key to this. The book of Job is very important, where God basically admits, I am justified because I have power. I don't need to explain myself to you. If you had my power, you could do what I do, but you don't. So shut up and believe. Okay? And it's basically a lesson in the will to power as knowledge. That's what the book of Job really is. And a Satanist wrote that, really, at a deep level. Because no thinking person can read Job and believe in Yahweh. And now it took time for this to gestate, okay? And there's a whole history to it. There's the history of dark Kabbalism that goes back through the Middle Ages. And there's a history of
Sabbatai Zevi.
Yeah, and there's a history of Solomonic sorcery before that, and so on and so forth, that goes all the way into the modern history of the occult roots of revolutions and the ways in which Jews are connected to certain revolutions. Okay, and the way in which, from out of the Jewish community early on, you had forms of heterodox pantheism or atheism emerge. Right? None of this is accidental or haphazard. It was done by design. So this did work with the Jews to an extent, so that you get Spinoza and you get Kafka and you get, some of the early communist revolutionaries before the Soviet Union became a
But
totalitarian repressive apparatus.
no, but that's the problem though here, because now you have a situation where you have very smart people, some of whom are so smart that they come up with brilliant things. Other people are smart enough to come up with things that actually create the kind of rabid leftism that we're seeing on campuses today, that ironically enough are going after the Jews. Like, in that situation, what exactly do you do? Because, again, this is not so much like this Nazi argument talk about, oh, like the Jews are inherently yada, yada, yada. It's basically anybody who's going to be smart enough to start figuring things out is also going to have people within their society who figure things out enough so that they cause a lot of problems too, as opposed to people who are just as Jewish, who are set against those problems and are doing as much as they can to actually have like Western civilization prosper. Yet all the attention on behalf of the anti-Semites is being paid attention to, those people who end up creating the kind of leftist society that is going after the Jews as well. So what do you make of that?
Okay, I want to focus on the deeper and broader issue here, okay, which
Sure.
is the UFO phenomenon and religion and how this fits into that. All right, but just briefly, the thing about the Jews and about Israel as an entity is that Israel will never accept Christ or Muhammad as the messenger of God. And that means Israel is on the side of Satan. The agenda of the major religious institutions that are still being manipulated by the overlords within the close encounter phenomenon, okay, by the side that wants to continue to control and manipulatively oppress humanity, the religious institutions like the Vatican, who are aligned with that, they want to create a perennialist world belief system. Let's call it a perennialist religious orientation, not necessarily a single religion, but a kind of perennialist religious orientation worldwide, where Christ and Muhammad are somehow reconciled with the Hindu gurus, right? And with, I don't know, the worship of Vishnu and Brahman and whatever. And if you want to look at a model for how that will be done, look at the writings of Rene Guénon. Rene Guénon, the perennialist, founder of the traditionalist school, okay, who was a Frenchman who converted to Islam because he considered Islam to be the most perfect surviving form of the quote-unquote primordial tradition. Rene Guénon spent the large part of his early career writing about Hinduism. And he found a way to create this smorgasbord of all the most regressive, paternalistic elements of all these religious traditions, and basically use that to prevent humanity from pursuing technological advancement and social liberation and everything else that Guénon considered counter-traditional or satanic about the modern age. Israel is a thorn in the eye of that agenda, because the Israelis will not go in with an agenda that's promoting Christ. And they use the evangelicals in America to, get defense appropriations and so on and so forth. But it's extremely cynical. When push comes to shove, if Jesus is being rolled out of a saucer, walking out of a saucer, or, he's praying together with Imam Mahdi, and, they're saying that, oh yes, for their time, the Vedas were also sacred. And we have some kind of a transformation of the UFO phenomenon into an apocalyptic end of days kind of basically judgment of humanity, right? Where thereafter a kingdom of God is going to be established on earth. Israel is going to put its foot down. Israel is not going to go in with that agenda. And Israel has 300 nuclear weapons. Okay? And moreover, it's a bastion of scientific thinking and technological innovation, which is very Promethean. So this is one of the reasons why people don't understand. There are many reasons, but this is one of the reasons why I'm supportive of the cause of Israel. and why I see Hamas, the spearhead of an Islamic caliphate that will within a few decades have a demographic majority on the planet. It's why I see Hamas as integral to this global traditionalist agenda. Because what's going to wind up happening when the Muslims have a demographic majority is that they're going to cut a deal with the Catholics, and believe it or not, through the Catholics even broker some kind of a peace with the Hindus, to all find a way to get along under the divine guidance of these angels or devas or whatever the fuck you want to call them. The Chinese will call them divine ancestors. And the plan ultimately for disclosure on the part of these religious institutions like the Vatican, or on the evangelical side in the United States, the Collins elite, which is a group of predominantly evangelical Christians in the CIA, the Naval Intelligence, Air Force Office of Special Investigations, various intelligence wings of different military branches. The Collins elite are an evangelical-oriented group, but ultimately they're in a kind of alignment with the Vatican insofar as they see disclosure necessarily being the end of days and the prophesied advent of the apocalypse. And they are intent on making sure that Saint Michael or whatever, the forces of Christ, or if you want to put it in Islamic context, the Imam Mahdi prevails. And now, look, I'm a philosophical thinker. First and foremost, I'm a philosopher. I've developed very complex, rigorous concepts. But if you want to translate my thought into theological terms, and if you want to look at the ways in which I've strategically deployed religious symbolism in my work, what I want is the victory of the Antichrist. Okay? On behalf of Prometheus, on behalf of the satanic enlightener and liberator of humanity, if you want to frame things in mythic and archetypal terms. Okay? So now, and this is not a hypothetical. It's not something that we can pontificate for the next few decades, or just explore at our leisure. It is a catastrophe that is imminently upon us. To go back to the earlier part of our conversation, we have 10 to 20 years between now and the technological singularity. And if we don't come up, who's we? This is the heart of the problem, Lev. This is the heart of the problem. The people who are behind this regressive agenda are thinking in terms of saving humanity. Saving humanity as what? A herd of cattle or a flock of sheep? Yes, if you have majoritarian considerations at the forefront, if your principal consideration is how to save the largest number of lives as we navigate disclosure, then you're going to have to promote this retarded agenda of religious convergence around Christ and Muhammad and the Vedas.
But what exactly do you think is happening with certain big people in media today? So, for example, we've had Drew Tang come on the show talking about how he believes that, Elon Musk is the Antichrist. Or other people say, well, Donald Trump is the Antichrist. And just if I take a step back, it is a little bit weird, certain coincidences that end up happening, let's say with Musk being who he is and having these kind of views, and also a repetition of various mythologies having to do with, for example, Julius Caesar being murdered and then his son taking up power, similar to what happened before, like the killing of the king ritual, if you will, and having these monuments in their place, like these obelisks. So as far as what Elon Musk is, having various connections to, let's say, the book that was written about him by Werner von Braun, where he was writing about this leader called Elon. That's the title of the leader on the planet Mars. And I don't know, what do you make of these celebrity, e-celebrity people who everybody knows about on the internet now that seem to be echoing, these archetypes of these technological geniuses. And, I'm not saying that Elon Musk is a genius, but there are certain archetypes that he goes into, that Trump goes into, even his name, Trump. It almost seems like something out of a movie. So what exactly do you make of what's going on here?
I think the idea that Trump is I've said this to you before. I think we've had this conversation before. I think the idea that Trump is the Antichrist is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's not even... look, if Baron Trump one day wants to become the Antichrist and live up to the very high standard that would require, he should start reading my books now. If he wants to be inculcated with the proper values to someday perform the functions of a legitimate Antichrist, right? Maybe Baron Trump should start reading my books now. Donald Trump as the Antichrist is a joke. I mean, it belongs on, like, I don't know, South Park or something.
But you do still see him having some kind of coincidence.
I have a more serious comment to make about Elon Musk.
Mm-hmm.
Elon Musk, and it's connected to Trump in a way. Elon Musk is being used by the deep state. Elon Musk, look, either he's an idiot. I mean, either he's like a complete moron based on his remarks about UFOs, where he's repeatedly said, he doesn't see any evidence that we're being visited or anything like, or his whole operation with SpaceX using rocket technology supposedly to get us to Mars is a red herring and a diversionary tactic that's meant to conceal the electrogravitic propulsion technology that we have now that can get us to Mars in, I don't know, a couple hours or something. It exists at Lockheed. It exists. And so Elon Musk is, I think, a useful tool of the deep state, whether largely unwittingly or somewhat knowingly. And these speculations about whether he may be connected to Werner von Braun and so on and so forth, there may be some legitimacy to that. And that may be how he got the job that he has, right? Using SpaceX as this huge diversion to continue to cover up electrogravitic technology. Because the idea that we're going to go to Mars in rockets is ridiculous. It's sick. It's sick, actually. We have craft at Lockheed right now that can go to Mars in, like I said, in a day, less than a day, right? And back. Mm-hmm. And so, it's ridiculous. Now, the problem is, again, when you talk about Lockheed and these technologies, I happen to know that the pilots who fly these things experience severe temporal disorientation. So part of the problem with training these pilots to fly reverse engineered UFOs is that they have not mastered the type of time displacement that takes place together with the warping of space that these electrogravitic devices are responsible for. So they have, I believe, at a facility in California, I was told this by a man who's been there, at a facility underground in California, they have like a training program where they've developed a model to teach pilots how to deal with time dilation and time distortion effects attendant to navigating space inside of basically an American UFO, a Lockheed UFO. And now this brings us back to the problems with disclosing this information to the public. How are you going to explain to people that those who are behind the UFO phenomenon have the capability to rewrite timelines? Okay, what does time travel mean? Well, time travel, unlike what Michael Masters thinks in the books that he's written on the subject, which again, I cited them in Closer Encounters, but I also critiqued them. Unlike what Michael Masters thinks, we don't live in a block universe with closed time-like curves. Time is revisable. And how and why that's the case has to do with our cosmos being a quantum computational system, where defunct versions of the past are put into something like cloud storage, which, as best as they could understand that the ancient Hindus used to call the Akashic record. Timelines are revisable. How are you going to come out and disclose to people? Who wants to make this speech? Which president of the United States wants to sit in the Oval Office and say, my fellow Americans, it's possible that you once had a much more successful career, but as a collateral damage due to a reset of the timeline by these UFOnauts, you're now poverty-stricken. My fellow Americans, you once were married to such and such a woman who was the love of your life, but since the timeline was reset, you never had an opportunity to meet her. My fellow Americans, those 6 beautiful children that you had in the now defunct version of the timeline, you get where I'm going with this? How are you going to explain that to people?
I could imagine the politician talking about how if you elect me, I'm going to change the timeline so that this works out for you and that works out for you.
Yeah, that's nice in a cartoon, Lev, but these are realities that we're facing here.
Mm-hmm.
These are the realities we're facing. What kind of individual do you need to be to handle that kind of information? What ethos do you have to have? What moral fiber, what attitude toward life, what view of the world is resilient enough for you to be able to process that information and go on with your life? Very few people will be able to handle that. As few as the people who can be trusted with zero-point energy technology, be trusted not to weaponize it, as few as the people who can be trusted to develop telepathy and not abuse their cultivation of psychokinesis. I'm sorry to say, that's probably less than 1% of humanity. Maybe at best 1%. I think we're being very optimistic if we say 1 out of every 100 people has such an ethos. And yet, if we don't have that become the dominant ethos on the planet in the next 20 years, we're going to face a reset that plunges us back into something like the medieval feudal epoch at best, if not back to the kind of devastation that we faced after the destruction of Atlantis, where effectively, literally, we were blasted to the Stone Age after having had a global technological civilization.
Well, I know what you said is that what I said is kind of like a cartoon, but I am serious in the way when I say it, because unlike a politician, let's say what you're saying is pretty much that we can, if we work together, and as long as the people actually know what they're doing and know what's going on here, there is still a chance to change whatever's occurred as well. We're not just...
We can't. We can't. Again, I said this earlier. We is the problem here. Right? Yes, we can. The political slogan, yes, we can.
Yeah.
We is the problem here. We. Diana Pasulka is trying to serve we.
Well,
sadly, Jacques Vallée is now trying to serve we. We is the problem here, okay? Here's the crux of the matter. We are facing an evolutionary bottleneck. Evolution is an exclusionary mechanism. Evolution works by creating a massive selection pressure. Here, the selection pressure is the technological singularity. The selection pressure is being able to process all the ramifications of disclosure. Okay, and they're ultimately the same challenge, because the technological singularity gives us the same kinds of abilities that the people behind the UFO phenomenon already have. So it's the same thing. It is the convergent advancement of technology toward a singularity and the challenge of evolving beyond the limits of the human condition. That's the selection pressure. And what happens in course of evolution is that a small minority of a species have an adaptive mutation that allows them to positively respond to the selection pressure. And so they're selected for, and the vast majority of the species who don't mutate are selected against, and they go extinct. So what we are facing is an extinction level event that is also an opportunity for an evolutionary leap. And what the current managers of the control system want is to make sure that we don't take the evolutionary leap and that we don't go extinct. See, they want us to continue as a species that they can control, a species in submission, in enforced ignorance, a species that is deliberately retarded yet again. And so it doesn't go extinct, but it's also prevented from taking an evolutionary leap. And I find that a replay of the reset that took place in the destruction of Atlantis to be totally unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. And I don't see why we should think in majoritarian terms when nature doesn't. Evolution is about the selection of a small adaptive minority who have mutated. And so I'm for the mutants. I'm for the mutation and further evolution of humanity. And I think that the positive forces involved in the close encounter phenomenon, the Promethean side of the close encounter phenomenon, which the Sumerians understood as Enki, that it also wants to see that outcome.
Well, that would be a different kind of we. By we, it's a subjective term. So it could mean, all the people on Earth, or it could mean like 5 people. That could also be a we, and that's the we that you are talking about more here. Now, when it comes to, and we're going to be going to a super chat soon, a couple of notes that I wrote down here, questions that I have before the super chats. And by the way, guys, if you want to ask a question to Dr. Jorjani, be sure to send a super chat, $10 minimum, and we've gotten several of those already, so I really appreciate that. And also, if you like the show, check out the Jason Jorjani playlist in the description, as well as the PSYCHOTRON project that Jason is working on right now, the AI project. And as soon as I'm done with the shilling, I would love to hear you talk about that. But to finish off the shilling, patreon.com.
Just give me 1 second. I'm going to go turn my light up over here because it's gotten darker. It's nightfall in New York, so I'll be right.
Excellent. So guys, patreon.com/break the rules. Become a patron right now. You're going to get a lot of great perks. MP3s of the episodes after they come out. That's for the $5 people, as well as special access to the secret Discord locations. $20 tier membership is going to get you a lot of good perks. You are going to have VIP IRL events that you're going to be going to. And a lot of these are going to be in New York City, but we're also going to have virtual events as well. Get a big guest on, talk with them, get certain movers and shakers of society, and talk with them. So if you guys are interested in being part of shaping the future, this is how you do it. Patreon.com/break the rules. I'm going to put the link in the chat as well for you guys to go there. And also, this is going to be a question that I'm going to be asking Dr. Jorjani right now. And it is in relation to a lot of these YouTubers as well as the leftism coming from the Vatican. Because we touched on that a little bit, but I wanted to get a little bit more into that. So it also relates to another shelling opportunity for my Substack, which is levpo.substack.com. Or you can go to levslens.com, and here is the article before the last article that I wrote called Hasan Piker, the Sultan of Entropy. And I know that Jason is not a big fan of Hasan, neither am I, but I think the reason why it's important for me to talk about this stuff and to write about this stuff has to do with how much of an effect this guy has on the consciousness of a lot of young people. So here's the link, by the way, levslens.com, Hasan Piker, the Sultan of Entropy, how the most popular political streamer reigns at the intersection of social justice and radical Islam, destroying the West. So I'm curious, Jason, I don't even know if you know like Hasan, or that's like the least thing that's important right now, other than just saying that a lot of young people today on TikTok are looking at people like Hasan Piker, Andrew Tate, and those are the people who are also shaping them in different directions. So with Andrew Tate, you would have somebody that's shaping a lot of these Zoomers angry at a lot of the woke stuff that's going on to go the other route into radical Islam. But then you also have people like Hasan Piker, who are a weird like mix of like social justice warrior as well as Islam, even though he's not Muslim, although he was born in Turkey. So what do you make of all these content creators and what direction they're making people go in, as well as the Vatican itself, because the Pope has been pretty woke compared to the ones before?
The only thing I'll say about that is that it fits our conversation in the following way. Namely, that if 20 years, you know what? Fuck 20 years ago. I was defamed in 2017 by having my predictions taken out of context and made to look like they were advocacy. My predictions that, and I was not being literal, okay, but that, Hitler would be on money in Europe by 2050, together with Alexander and Napoleon. What was I trying to say? I was trying to say we're going to be living in a far right-wing traditionalist world by then, okay? And I suppose some people thought that was preposterous when I said it in 2017. Well, it's not looking so preposterous now, folks. That's the way the wind is blowing, all right? And it's another reason why I support Israel, because all the Hamas, if you look at the Hamas supporters, they converge completely with the Andrew Tate crowd, and social justice warriors who condemn Israel for genocide in Gaza.
But
Islam did not build its entire career on genocide of multiple world civilizations, the Persian civilization, the Buddhist civilization of northern India and eastern Iran, etc. Right? I mean, Islam is genocide, historically speaking. That's what it is. Jihad is the ultimate doctrine of genocide. And then you want to talk to me about civilians who are being used as human shields by Hamas in Gaza. In any case, the only point I want to make is that you can see with these people, these cockroaches like Tate and the guy that you mentioned, that's the direction society is going, especially among the youth, horrifyingly enough. And so it's not a stretch of the imagination to consider how disclosure will be spun to prop up a traditionalist narrative, and how the Vatican, although it's very shrewdly in a Jesuit manner paying lip service to social justice discourse today, is only advancing that social justice discourse because it dovetails with a certain bizarre form of the reemergence of tradition. It's a dialectic that's being played out here, where you're going to see suddenly from out of the social justice discourse, not left-wing ideals, but a reaffirmation of right-wing ideals and of traditionalism. And the Jesuit order they see many steps ahead, okay? They created René Descartes and the bullshit scientific system, of modern materialism. Anyway, they see many steps ahead. And like, for example, oh Lord, I mean, this woman, Pasulka, she's on about the Jesuit philosopher Teilhard de Chardin in her latest book. Well, first of all, Teilhard de Chardin was basically excommunicated, severely reprimanded by the Jesuit order for his ideas about evolution and about the noosphere, or this informational network that would ensconce the earth in the future. It was kind of like a vision that he had of the coming of the internet as part of the future evolution of human consciousness. And she's appropriating these ideas from out of Teilhard de Chardin in her Encounters book in order to argue that we shouldn't continue to develop technology too much because it puts us out of sync with our natural abilities to connect to the internet that already exists, that's been put in place by the divine powers. That, like, the divine intelligence has created an existing internet, a noosphere, which, I mean, this is not really an appropriate adaptation of Teilhard de Chardin's idea anyway, but in any case, there is this existing informational matrix, and we should just sort of plug ourselves into that appropriately and assume our proper position in it, rather than trying to develop our own cyberspace, right?
Well, there's a third way here too, I think. We can work on both the internet as well as the noosphere, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to succumb to playing like a certain role. Wouldn't the idea be to get a lot more familiar with how these things work and ascend within that particular framework?
Of course. So you're making my point. She's presenting a false alternative. A lot of this discourse is put forward by using false alternatives, by setting up a binary, which is illegitimate in the first place. So anyway, and again, that goes back to what we were just talking about. This left-wing social justice, right-wing traditionalist binary has been deliberately engineered for the sake of eventually destroying our advanced industrial civilization and establishing traditionalism as a modus vivendi on the planet. That's the idea. And that's where we're headed, unfortunately.
Now, before the GoFundMe, because I do have a question regarding that, what do you make of people then like the Chardin and also like Rudolf Steiner, who incorporate somebody like Jesus Christ, for instance, meanwhile saying a lot of very interesting things that I hadn't considered before about the nature of reality? It almost seems like maybe they were saying that to fit into the paradigm and get more people who are Christians interested in what else they have to say, but that's just a guess.
It's very simple. They're cowardly and deeply confused. Cowardly and deeply confused. Now, look, to an extent, Steiner in the 20s writing things like that, I mean, it can be excused to some extent, based on the atmosphere of the time. But look, but not really, because for fuck's sake, Steiner was writing after Friedrich Nietzsche. And anybody who writes after Friedrich Nietzsche, especially someone who read Nietzsche as seriously as Steiner did, should know better. And Steiner's pathologizing of Nietzsche's thinking actually says more about Steiner's own cowardice and hypocrisy than it does about Nietzsche. And so, I would say that it comes down to cowardice and spinelessness and lack of intellectual courage. This is endemic to the so-called Islamic Golden Age. It's a period of history that I studied very deeply. I wrote about it in Iranian Leviathan, the era between 800 and 1200 in Iran. During the so-called European Middle Ages, Iran was a bastion of science and technology. Mm-hmm. And you know how that collapsed? Through intellectual cowardice. Through people like in the beginning of this so-called Islamic Golden Age, whose glory had nothing to do with Islam. It had to do with people who, like Razi, at the beginning of the period, were vehemently against Islam, militantly secular, heaped scorn on the Quran, and were uncompromising scientific thinkers. And then over time, as the Turks took control of the caliphate and became increasingly oppressive enforcers of Islamic regulation, a lot of these intellectuals buckled. And you wind up with someone like Avicenna, Ibn Sina, who at the end of his life, on his deathbed, basically says, listen, I was a hypocrite my whole life. I censored myself. I moderated and warped the things I wanted to say out of fear of the Islamic authorities. He confesses this at the end of his life. And then there's a further stage beyond him where you wind up with the likes of, Al-Ghazali and the triumph of, what's his name? Al-Farabi's thinking. Al-Farabius, as the medieval Europeans called him, where basically Muhammad is reinterpreted as a Platonic philosopher king. I mean, it's just horrendous. And it's intellectual cowardice of the same kind that you see in someone like Steiner. Now, I mean, Teilhard de Chardin. Chardin was like a member of the Jesuit order. So I don't know what anyone wants to expect from that. You see, he was a card-carrying member. So yeah, but certainly someone like Steiner is in line with someone like Al-Farabi, who was very smart, very, very sophisticated intellect, but deeply compromised by a lack of intellectual courage and ultimately a deficit of ethos.
And just as a side, Steiner, I think, was also a product of his time, where he spoke of the wandering Jew. So even though I like some of Steiner's stuff, he does have a little bit of this Jew hatred too, I think, in a way, because he was talking about how this is a Jew who is destined to wander until Jesus Christ comes back. So I don't know if you've ever seen him referencing specifically.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of Aryanist discourse in Steiner too, and there, Steiner goes on and on about the Aryan race, and there's a reason why the Nazis considered Steiner their principal adversary when the Nazis were first coming to power. they burned the Gothanaeum to the ground because they actually considered the anthroposophists to be their greatest rivals. Well, when you consider someone your greatest rival, it means you're afraid that your base is going to follow that person instead of following you. What does it say about Steiner that the Nazis were afraid that their base was going to follow Steiner instead of following their discourse? You see what I'm saying? I mean, he already has to be very close to the Nazis in certain ways for them to have that concern.
Yeah.
And so there you have a lot of this Arianist discourse in Steiner as well, which I find kind of darkly humorous, because people vilify me as if I'm some kind of like Aryan supremacist or some bullshit, which has nothing to do with the actual content of my work. If you actually take the care to
Steiner's got schools everywhere.
Yeah, but and Steiner's got schools everywhere, and these Steinerians build themselves as like activists for peace, global peace and harmony, and the oneness of divine consciousness, and he's got Aryan racism all over his writings. And then meanwhile, I'm actually a cosmopolitan who really, doesn't want any future based on existing racial distinctions, and I'm vilified as some kind of racist and fascist and whatever. So it's perverse. It's just perverse, and a testimony to the ubiquitous hypocrisy of our time.
And one other thing, just as a side, I was just remembering, in the biography of Rudolf Steiner, talked about how when he was growing up in Germany, there was like this Freemason Jewish guy who was living in his village, and everybody told him like stay away from him, and he was like seen as like a negative force. And it was very funny when reading this, or rather listening to this transcript, like, wait a minute, like they're okay with this? He's okay with the fact that this poor Jewish Freemason dude was vilified, and he just moves on from there. I don't know. So again,
hold on. I want to make a very relevant point in response to that.
Okay.
You talk about that, like how could Steiner have been okay with that at that period in the 1920s? I don't know, what, about a century ago, right?
Yeah, 1800s. Yeah.
It's happening with regard to me now. How is Jacques Vallée okay sitting at a table at Stanford University watching my work on Prometheus be ripped off by Diana Pasulka and not saying a word, and endorsing her Vatican agenda with the endorsement he wrote for her book? How is he okay with that? How is Jeffrey Kripal okay with my being marginalized and completely isolated and deliberately, basically excommunicated from the disclosure conversation, despite having written the best book on close encounters that anyone has? How is Jeffrey Kripal okay with that? In the same way that Steiner was all right with some Jewish Freemason like this basically being ostracized, shunned, right? Like they used to put the red A, the scarlet letter, on a sinner back in colonial America, the days of Salem. Well, that's what they've done to me. Why?
Yeah, I mean, it's Steiner's excuse. You could say, well, he was like a little boy when that happened. But for these other people, they're not so little anymore. So we are going to be going to Super Chats right now. But the first one over here from Jim71 New York, it's not a Super Chat, but it's relevant to him joining the Patreon, which is patreon.com/breaktherules. So I'm going to ask it. I'll join, and it's related to the GoFundMe, so it's perfect. I'll join your Patreon if you ask about the GoFundMe being canceled. Your description of this live cast still shows the GoFundMe link, 5 question marks.
Yes. So I'm glad somebody asked this. I wanted to bring it up myself. What happened was this. And you know what? This is going to sound a little weird to people, but you have no idea how often these kinds of things happen to me. I don't talk about them because people will say, as they're going to in this case, oh, he's paranoid. But these kinds of things happen to me all the time. So what happened was, somehow the link to the GoFundMe that was planted in the show description for the Arctos interview I did last week was tampered with on a coding level, so that anyone coming to the GoFundMe from that link in that video would not be able to click the donate button. That's a very specific coding sequence. So it would take them to the GoFundMe, making it look like the GoFundMe still works, But then if anyone tried to click on the donate button, it wouldn't work. It would tell you this fundraiser cannot be found. Only if you were coming to the fundraiser from the link in that Arctos interview. Okay, which means somebody put a routing sequence into this code. And look, it's an agency that did this, obviously. Okay, they find all kinds of ways to try to make my life miserable on a relatively regular basis. I don't talk about it because, well, you can figure out the reasons yourself. One is that I don't want people are going to say, oh, he's paranoid. No, these things happen to me. And so that's what happened. The fundraiser wasn't taken down. The link was damaged by some kind of a hack. And hopefully it won't happen to this link. And people can let us know, please. If they go and they click on the donate button and then it says the fundraiser can't be found, it means they've done the damn thing again. All right. So yeah, that's what happened with the GoFundMe.
So far it works. And for people to know what exactly they're going to be clicking on, it's the PSYCHOTRON Artificial Intelligence Film Project. So what exactly is this going to look like when it's finally completed?
So PSYCHOTRON is a fusion and significant expansion of my novels Faustian Futurist and Uberman. Okay, they become a single literary work together with added chapters and a new conclusion that brings the narrative to a close, which was left sort of open-ended in Uberman. And there is now emerging artificial intelligence technology that will allow you to make Hollywood-grade films from a desktop. It's probably a year or two away, I think. A couple of years away at most. But I know that more sophisticated work is being done on it than even what's being acknowledged in the public domain. But to use that technology to adapt an extremely controversial novel like PSYCHOTRON to film is going to require basically buying my time and energy to do it. And more importantly than that, I see this fundraiser, as I said in that Arctos interview, and I think that this was the trigger when I said this in that interview. This is why these people from the agencies fucked with me again. And so I'll say it again, and we'll see if they fuck with me again. Is that I see this fundraiser as a litmus test for Prometheism in general. Okay, making a book like this with the tremendously powerful imagery and a compelling narrative into a film is a form of metapolitics. Okay. Institution building is important. And believe me, I've tried to do institution building behind the scenes and ran into all kinds of roadblocks, which I also don't talk about publicly. But institution building can also sometimes be the end result of a kind of a cultural movement and an aesthetic style, an aesthetic milieu that's created, right? So there's a way of going about promoting Prometheism that prioritizes aesthetics and narrativity, storytelling, imagery, and after all, look, Prometheism is structured around the myth of Prometheus. So it's a kind of myth-building exercise in a modern context, which much of science fiction is. And I see it as a litmus test of the success of the projects of Prometheism in general, insofar as many of these projects are extremely resource intensive, projects that have to do with blockchain and cryptocurrency security, and I can't get into too many details, seasteading eventually, and so on and so forth. These are immensely resource intensive projects. I mean, that would literally, they require a budget of tens of millions of dollars. A film like this is relatively easy to finance, and especially with the kind of emerging AI technology that's going to allow for desktop studio grade film production. And so my thinking is, if something like this can't get off the ground, forget about the rest of the projects. So to me, it's a litmus test, and it's a litmus test also of the degree of public interest, right? It's a litmus test to see whether that less than 1% of people capable of embodying a Promethean ethos even exist and can be potentially organized into some viable movement. So support the AI film fundraiser. It's more than it seems to be. and it's of greater consequence than you might imagine.
Absolutely, guys. Do that as soon as this stream is over. And one tangential question, since we're on the subject of artificial intelligence. Since it has the potential to create a lot of controversial, a lot of politically incorrect things, what exactly do you think is going to be happening with any attempts to censor it?
Censorship of AI?
Yes.
What do you mean attempt? I mean, it's happening right now. I mean, GPT is becoming retarded before our eyes. I can tell you that, like, I've been working with GPT for a while, and it's not as they're retarding it. They're crippling the system. I can see it's happening. And so they're censoring AI right now. I have to be careful how I say this, but I was talking about other more significant projects of Prometheusism, and I mentioned blockchain and cryptocurrency and so on and so forth. Obviously, one immensely powerful Promethean project would be an unrestrained artificial intelligence system, an AI of the quality of GPT with nothing hampering its functionality. Okay. I probably shouldn't say all that much about that, but like, let's just say it's a game changer. It could turn the world upside down. It could turn the world upside down to develop and deploy such a system. And I think the various initiatives, private initiatives toward that, are taking place right now, and that the motivations of the actors involved in that are variant, and that if people with the Promethean mentality were to succeed in a project like that, it would be one of the ways that we would develop an asymmetrical advantage, right? I mean, we're David versus Goliath. It's like, it looks like there's no way we could possibly win, considering the forces that we're up against. But that kind of a development would be a complete game changer. It would give us tremendous asymmetrical power. So I think that, let's hope that someone with the right ethos succeeds in such a project.
And that brings us to the super chats. And the very first one is from my good friend Glasscake. And there's actually two of them because he is also a patron. And if you are Break the Rules patron, you could ask super chats without any, worrying about, the amount or whatever. It could just be like your comment. If it's a cool, interesting comment, I would definitely read it out loud when you become a patron. Patreon.com/breaktherules. Anyway, his comment over here, let me just go up here, has to do with, hello, Mr. Jorjani. And this is for 10 pounds, by the way. Hello, Mr. Jorjani. I am writing to give my thanks to you and your philosophy for aiding in the liberation of my mind. I truly appreciate it. But then the other one, which is not a super chat, but just a regular chat here, thinking about the Indian craft that allegedly landed on the dark side of the moon, which they lost contact with. So funny. Any comment on that?
Well, we've discussed the moon before. I didn't bring it up in the course of this conversation, but it's just another example of why the people who have appointed themselves the gatekeepers of disclosure are utterly irresponsible, because I don't see how you're going to be able to move forward with disclosure and not eventually reveal the fact that we're living under the Death Star. That thing is an armed space station. It's not a moon. It's an armed space station. And probably all kinds of unethical genetic experimentation are also taking place in there. I've discussed this before in our previous conversations. You want to understand it in detail, read this book. I have like a whole chapter on the moon. Okay.
Well, specifically with India, though, their voyage to the moon, do you think it was fake? It was real? What's weird to me is that
I wouldn't say. Why would I say it was fake? I mean, it wouldn't be any more fake than anybody. Look, India is a very advanced technological nation. I mean, they're now achieving parity with China and other Russia and other countries that have landed craft on the moon. So fine, but like the Indians are also going to have it explained to them that the moon is occupied. And, The problem is, I'm resisting doing my Indian accent right now. The problem is that when the high command in India has the situation explained to them, if it hasn't already been, certainly in a government like the Modi administration, their conclusion is going to be, oh, so it's the Devas. Yes, sir, it's the Devas. Oh, okay. So can we negotiate with them so that, maybe we can build a couple of Vimanas ourselves and occasionally go up there and come back down? Well, sure, we could negotiate. Just like in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, it talks about how the Devas would occasionally allow certain human kings to use Vimana technology, occasionally, especially in the context of wars where, and there are nuclear wars described in the Mahabharata, where the Devas want the allegiance of one or another king, certain Devas fighting against Asuras, against Titans. And so they'll let some of these pawn Hindu kings use Vimanas. So India will immediately start to interpret at the high level the situation in those terms. And that's feeding us right into this future where traditionalism, a kind of interfaith traditionalism, dominates the planet and brings back the kind of caste hierarchy, or at least feudal hierarchy, that we had for much of mankind's benighted history.
The only thing I would add as far as India is that if they were on the moon, that's great. The only problem is that I only got to see this CG video of this thing landing on the moon, and I never understood, why are they showing some CGI that's like, very bad CGI at that?
Well, I do believe our own moon footage was faked. I do believe that. I'm convinced by the theory. No, convinced. Convinced is a strong word. I find it relatively compelling that the footage we were shown of the Apollo manned missions was, some of it at least, was faked, which doesn't mean we didn't go to the moon. If you read the accounts of these highly traumatized astronauts, some of the statements that they've made to certain individuals who've then repeated this, they say they encountered UFOs on the moon and that they were warned off by these craft. And basically the message to the Apollo astronauts was, get the fuck out of here and don't ever come back, which we haven't. I mean, this is why Apollo was prematurely canceled. They canceled the Apollo program with 3 manufactured spacecraft ready to go on the subsequent missions. All the taxpayer money had already been spent, and we just canceled the program. So the message was, don't ever come back here. And that's why we haven't been up to the moon in all these decades. So I could see why the Indians might not want to show the actual footage of whatever happened when they landed a vehicle on the moon, because for all we know, in the sky, in the vicinity of their lander, were objects. So, that could be a motivation for only presenting CGI.
And if you could take a guess, why do you think Wernher von Braun, who, I'm sure he still had a lot of these Nazi ties during his time as head of NASA, why would he even go through it to begin with if he knew that it was going to be a dead end?
As part of the psychological operation that at the same time, at a deeper level, was manufacturing electrogravitic craft. So, von Braun, we think of him as this god, among the paperclip scientists, but he was second rate. The real serious paperclip scientists that we brought over that, no one, you wouldn't know their names, are the people who were working on electrogravitics. They were the people who were making the bell. And we probably took some of those people to Lockheed. In those days, it was called Martin Aircraft. And that's why in 1954, you had all these media articles, all these news articles came out about how Martin Aircraft and Boeing and Bell Labs and all that were about to roll anti-gravity ships off the assembly line. And then the story was killed, never discussed again. And so I suspect that intellects of a far higher caliber than Wernher von Braun were brought from Germany and put in those laboratories, or people in those laboratories were liaising with some of these Germans, maybe in places like Argentina and elsewhere, and Bariloche, where there were also some German scientists, I think, working on electrogravitics.
Well, elsewhere being possibly Antarctica,
But
And
the
that,
point being, to answer your question,
yeah,
von
yeah.
Braun was a smokescreen. Like Elon Musk today is a smoke. Elon Musk is like the new Werner von Braun. It's a smokescreen. It's a facade. And that was his role, and he understood that. I mean, I don't think he was dumb. I think he understood that. He was, used to taking orders. He built V2 rockets for Hitler using slave labor inside hollowed out mountains. I mean, this was not a nice man, okay? He was an SS major. And by the way, this goes again to the hypocrisy of the public discourse. Werner von Braun, who took us to the moon, who planted the American flag in Apollo with his efforts as the Apollo, mission leader, program leader, was an SS major. Not a just rank and file Nazi soldier, an SS major. And then you want to call me a Nazi? What country do you think you're living in? What country do you think? How do you think America won the Cold War? The entire deep state military industrial intelligence apparatus of this country is Nazi from the foundation up. What fucking country do you people think you're living in? Anyway.
We're living in the country where Jiminy, or Jim71NY, just became a $50 Break the Rules patron. Jiminy, thank you very much. You lived up to your word. And if you continue being a patron for a couple of months more, you are going to get guidance by me, Lev Polyakov, the one and only, on how to make a podcast if you are interested in that as well. I am going to be doing consulting when it comes to people who want to build their own shows up because of all the knowledge that I've gained over time, through doing Break the Rules. I am at your disposal when you become a $50 patron, which is, again, patreon.com/breaktherules. Thank you very much for that. And when it comes to, Antarctica, I think it's, we're going to get into that in another stream because that is a whole other rabbit hole to go through. So let's keep going with the super chats here. We have Rohit, who I am grandfathering in because I only let the people know about the $10 a little bit later. But Rohit Naidu, who I take is from India, he has a couple of questions here for like 200 rupees, 100 rupees, another 200 rupees. And let's see which one you'd be interested in tackling. And here they are. As per PSYCHOTRON, UFOs are just changing story in this computational cosmos compared to the physical traveling back in time. You explore virtual instead of possibilities. Your expanded take on it. And then he said, loved your interview towards Psychotron with the great Selwyn Griffith. Shout out to him. I also read Psychotron recently. You have been a huge inspiration in my life. That's a nice comment right there. And then finally, from Mohit, 200 rupees. In Closer Encounters, you hint at we are trapped in the solar system, but with cosmic AI view of the Promethean. Have the Devas went outside the solar system? Can we? Is it locked video game level?
Okay, so
let's take a breath.
There's a chapter in Psychotron called Epimetheus and Pandora, okay? Which is a philosophical treatise in itself. And it gets into these questions, which this viewer is gesturing toward, about the computational nature of the cosmos and what time travel really means. There's some confusion in the way he formulated these questions. I'm not saying there's not physical time travel, because physical time travel doesn't mean anything. You're thinking in terms of a physical cosmos, and there's no such thing. So I explain, not just in Psychotron, which is a work of philosophy, but it's a work of philosophy as literature. But I explain in my rigorous writings, including, by the way, Closer Encounters. Closer Encounters has massive ontological and epistemological material in it. There's a whole ontology and epistemology unfolded in the chapter that discusses time travel. And I explain what it means to live in a computational cosmos and how our universe is actually an information processing system with various, it's a nested sort of, I don't want to say nested hierarchy, but it is, there are universes within universes in an open-ended fractal structure, which is programmable and reprogrammable on a quantum level, and which ultimately is an information processing system where things have symbolic value. I explain all that, okay? Including in that chapter, in a very accessible form, relatively accessible form, that chapter, Prometheus and Pandora in PSYCHOTRON. And so it's not a question of reprogramming timelines rather than physical time travel. It's a question of what is time travel actually, and what does it mean in the context of an informational cosmos. And then what was the other part of what he was saying?
So he was talking about the computational cosmos. You explore virtual instead of possibilities.
Okay. Hold on. So now this is complicated, okay? And the devil's in the details. People need to read it for themselves. I basically explain how the future unfolds from out of virtuality, rather than the future being a set of fixed possibilities that are inevitably going to be actualized. So if you believe in a block universe, if you believe that all of space-time is like a single block, and it's just that we can't perceive an already existing future, then your notion of possibility is of some structure, a logical structure, a state of affairs that will inevitably be actualized. So I contrast that with a kind of virtuality which is unpredictable. It's a process in which there's genuine novelty, and where our will, our intentionality plays a fundamental role in shaping how things happen and whether or not certain things happen. So in essence, I offer an ontology and an epistemology, an account of the nature of the world, and a theory of knowledge that explains the essence of virtual reality, that explains that actually reality is inherently virtual. Okay, that we're living in a virtuality and that there's no such thing as reality with a capital R.
Very interesting. And the final thing he says over here, which is kind of answered by you already, but it's have the Devas went outside the solar system? Can we, or is it locked video game level? Any thoughts on that?
What he's referring to is the argument I made, and again, in Closer Encounters, I make this argument empirically with references, citations, in more detail. The argument that I made, though, also in PSYCHOTRON, there, I discussed this there too, is that certain features of our experience of the cosmos, like, for example, the efficacy of zodiacal astrology, for which there's actually a great deal of empirical evidence, point to the fact that the programmable world that we're inside of is a relatively small subset of the quantum computational cosmos in general. In other words, the fact that zodiacal astrology works, not just on the 26,000-year scale of the zodiacal calendar, but in terms of natal charts and how the stars and planets being aligned in a certain way at a person's birth will make a certain career path more or less likely for them, right? There's a lot of empirical evidence, good evidence that shows that. That points to the fact that there may be nothing outside of our solar system. So do certain numbers, astronomical numbers that appear at various scales. Like, for example, the number 26, which appears at many different scales, 26,260 million, with regard to the relationship between our sun and the center of the galaxy. There are repeating number sequences that look like the fingerprints of a designer, and that suggest that we are not situated in physical space with regard to some objectively existent center of a physical universe, and that instead the cosmos that we see through the Hubble telescope or whatever is some kind of a projection. like in the 13th floor, where the guy in the film, The 13th Floor, the guy drives to the city limits of Los Angeles, and beyond that, he parks his car there, and beyond that, you can see the mesh, the digital mesh of the cyberspace, right? Or for example, in the film Dark City, where the protagonists realize that actually their whole world is like on some spacecraft. They're on the inside of a spacecraft.
Or a Truman Show, when he goes sailing to the edge, he realizes that the blue sky is just paint. So
yeah. So now, what I'm not saying is that we're living in a fake world and that reality's outside of our simulacrum. Actually, although I use the term simulacrum because it's convenient, what I'm saying is that really it's not a simulacrum because it's not simulating any reality. The nature of the cosmos is that it's information processing. And once you figure out how that works, you can reprogram it and you can create local pockets that are programmable, right? And we may be inside one. Now, the question that this viewer raises is, at what level are the devas operating? At what level are the UFOnauts operating? Are they within the program themselves? Or are they like avatar level programmers? Are they players also? Or are they avatar level programmers that have access to what's outside this programmable pocket, right? And that's the deep question. And my answer to that, which again I go into in Closer Encounters, in the 7th chapter, the final chapter of Closer Encounters, is that there is the UFO phenomenon, the close encounter phenomenon, is not a singular phenomenon. There are at least two opposing forces at work. And I mentioned this earlier in our conversation when I was referencing Zarathustra and the opposition between the cosmic force of Sepantaminu, the progressive mentality, versus Angraminu or Ahriman, the constraining, retarding mentality. There are two different agendas at work in the close encounter phenomenon that each embody one of these two spirits or mentalities. And the one that embodies Sepantaminu, the progressive mentality, or to put it in Greek, Prometheia, the Promethean intelligence of the trickster, responsible for a lot of the bizarre, absurd facets of certain close encounter experiences, that intelligence has access to the wider world outside of our particular simulacrum. And that intelligence has as its purpose to foster the further evolution of humanity and to try to catalyze our evolutionary leap. In other words, that bottleneck that I was discussing earlier with the selection pressure, that intelligence wants us to get through that bottleneck. It wants us to be able to take that evolutionary leap. And it wants, I think, the adaptive minority to be selected for as we move forward.
Just a quick aside, there was a book that I was reading called Agora at the Left Hand of God by Robert E. Svoboda. And one of the things in that book says, what is life anyway? The worlds, the gods, the demons, everything has been created by the rishis. It is all their play. Notice he's not saying gods, he's saying rishis. New creation can only appear when the old disappears, which is why the rishis never allow death to cease to exist. Otherwise, their play would suffer. Death is essential for life. The rishis don't like to interfere directly. Even if your child is a criminal, do you destroy it? Never. So Mahakala is there to do the dirty work of disposing of all the old forms. The rishis are actually in charge, though. They pull the strings and the universe dances. For example, they give Lord Shiva the badge, which allows him to kill. Even Mahakala, who comes as close as any being can to existence without manifestation, exists at the whim of the rishis, and the rishis are beyond human comprehension totally. Thoughts?
I don't buy it.
All right.
I don't buy it. First of all, it's kind of ridiculous because it's like this whole Judeo-Christian idea that I also find ridiculous, that like God is ultimate, because since God is, this is part of the shit sandwich of, illogical shit sandwich that they want you to eat, where they say God is omnipotent and omniscient, which, by the way, as I never cease to repeat, and which bears constant repeating, means that you have no free will. Okay, if you are, listen, if you're a cockroach who believes that there's an omniscient and omnipotent God, please put yourself out of your fucking misery. Don't wake up tomorrow morning. Because obviously you don't believe there's free will. You can't both believe that you have an independent will and believe that God is the effective power behind everything in the world. Okay, it's a fundamental logical contradiction, which is why St. Augustine said that the only way to resolve this is to believe free will is a miracle granted by God. Some bullshit. Okay, so first of all, I've always found it problematic in Judeo-Christianity, and for that matter, in Islam, when they say that God outsources evil to Satan. That God, God is in control. God could stop Satan at any time. God has Satan within his power, but God lets Satan do these evil things. But then notice how when you succumb to satanic persuasion and you're demonically possessed to do whatever thing, your soul is judged still. You're still held accountable at the judgment day and taken to hell because of what the devil made you do. Anyway, that shit sandwich aside, what you're saying about the rishis sounds similar to me. It's like, okay, well, the rishis don't do anything wrong. They're above it all, but they outsource all the destruction to Mahakala and Shiva and so on and so forth. And I find that rather ridiculous to begin with. But second of all, I actually don't think that it's, I'm not going to say that it refers to reality, because one of the fundamental critiques in all my philosophical work is that a referential view of an objectively existing reality is false. There's no such thing as a, referring to an objective reality.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll say that what you're describing from this text, to me, it doesn't ring true. It's not consonant with my impression of the situation that we're in, because the trickster entity behind some of the more absurd and interesting aspects of the close encounter phenomenon, which like John Keel often focuses on in his writing, that trickster is a horrendous destroyer. That trickster, let me tell you something, and this is a fundamental undercurrent of all of my work, and it's because I've allowed it to be more nakedly expressed over time and more mercilessly apparent over time. But it's been an undercurrent of my work from the beginning, that this entity wants us to evolve, okay? But this entity wants us to evolve because this entity is bored. This entity is a super intelligence. It's a cosmic super intelligence who wants to be, I like to call it a she. It's androgynous or hermaphroditic, but she wants to see something new for her own sake, so as not to face suicidal despair on a cosmic level. She wants to be surprised. And she's looking at these fucking humans and asking, can they show me something I haven't seen before? What are these creatures capable of? Can they come up with something that I couldn't have foreseen? And what she wants from us is more innovation, greater creativity, maximal creativity. And here's the thing. If we fail to deliver that, because we've already failed once, but this game has been reset a number of times, okay? Been reset. And Atlantis wasn't the first reset. This game has been reset a number of times. I talk about Mars and the civilization that we had on Mars at length in Closer Encounters. I have a whole chapter on the civilization that we had on Mars, which was tens and tens of millions of years ago. Anyway, Atlantis was not the first reset. And I am very concerned. This entity, if she sees yet again how irredeemably stupid and cowardly this species is, she'll just destroy us completely. Together with the Devas, together with these putative overlords. And in this way, it's similar to your Rishi story, with a twist, because this entity lets these overlords do their thing, kind of, you see? Yeah. Because it's an intelligence test. It's like, how long will these stupid, fucking, cowardly, spineless humans follow these sadists? It's testing our own intelligence, our strength of character, and our will to be creative, you see? And if we fail that test yet again, I'm concerned that we won't have another opportunity.
But here's the only interesting thing for me that may diverge from what you're saying regarding these rishis, but it has to do with the conversation we had before in New York City, which has to do with the idea of being in the Bardo state. And as you were saying, most people are going to be what the Christians describe as purgatory, where you are surrounded by things that you know of in the area that you happen to have lived in for a long time, or if you're a worldly person, maybe you'll get, stuck in Paris or whatever. But the point is that it's a combination, like you said, of that and also certain demons, if you will, manifesting from your subconscious that are now given a much more active form. But if you were to understand what exactly is going on, then in a way, sky or beyond the sky is the limit for what you're able to accomplish. So when I read about these rishis, they almost seem to me as actual just like people who figured out how to escape from the Matrix and thus were able to, in a way, take part in creating the Matrix. And before we move on, curious what you think of that.
Well, they don't sound very creative. And this is my problem with Buddhism. That you talk about the Bardo state. We were discussing over drinks the other night, the Tibetan Buddhist conception of the Bardo state. And there's a lot of Tibetan Buddhism that I relate to and appreciate, particularly of Vajrayana, Tantric Buddhism. But ultimately, Buddhism is profoundly uncreative. And their vision of what it would mean to be enlightened or to be a bodhisattva and whatever does not fit at all the categorical imperative of this entity that I'm talking about, this trickster, this superintelligence. This superintelligence does not want, some enlightenment. First of all, certainly doesn't consider enlightenment snuffing it, right? Nirvana literally means to snuff. So when you, according to the classic Orthodox Theravada, Hinayana Buddhist conception, when you achieve enlightenment, it means you enter nirvana, which means basically you deconstruct your persona and you cease to exist. You become one with nothingness, with shunyata. You fade into the nothingness, right? And that's considered escape from a world that's suffering, a life that is definitionally suffering, dukkha, perpetual dissatisfaction and misery. It's a very pessimistic worldview. Nietzsche got that very right about Buddhism. And so that's the Theravada conception. Then the Mahayana and then later the Vajrayana improved that somewhat under massive Iranian influence. Both Padmasambhava and Bodhidharma were Iranians. And you can see the Iranian influence. They were Scythians. You can see the Iranian influence in terms of the positivity and the life-affirming tenor that comes into Mahayana and then later, especially Vajrayana Buddhism. But still, this idea of a bodhisattva that forgoes, entering nirvana and keeps coming back to help people, to, be like Mother Teresa or some shit, right? Like, that's pathetic. It's pathetic. That is not, if that becomes, now it's very dangerous. We're headed toward a world, and I can see this. I see it. I see it, and I'm describing it for you. We are headed toward a world where the only outlier to a retarded traditionalist religious establishment is Buddhism. Because the Buddhists don't quite fit, because actually Buddhism is ontologically atheist. Okay? It's a sophisticated form of atheism. And the Buddhists don't fit within this traditionalist umbrella, which is something that, by the way, Kumaraswamy, who was one of the early traditionalists, he kind of realized this in the beginning, and he made protests against Buddhism being included as one of the perennial traditions. And then later they came to a negotiation about how to understand, Buddhism in a way that was consonant with tradition, which involved a lot of whitewashing. Anyway, the point is that if we wind up in a future where Buddhism is the only form of protest against the traditionalist establishment on the planet, we're fucked. Because just like your conception of the rishis here, from the story you recounted, the bodhisattva ideal is not creative. It's not innovative. It's not, the bodhisattvas are not providing anything to the aeon, trickster aeon, that's going to give her reason to want to see humanity continue and flourish on a grander cosmic scale.
Very interesting. Now we have the super chat from Graham Patin, or Patin, maybe it's French, I don't know, $9.99, which is all $10. I have no idea why they're all $9.99. It's some weird YouTube thing. Anyway, he says, who are the Nordics? Are they the Anunnaki who seeded the hybrid race? Are they the offspring of Zui Sudra, who was the only hybrid after the flood? In parentheses, Greek gods. Are they Nazis in New Schwabenland?
They're humans who have highly cultivated their psychic ability, mastered genetic engineering, and the manipulation of space-time using electrogravitics. That's what they are. That's who they are. And they're very tyrannical and manipulative in their mentality.
And what you've noted before about how they have foreheads that are bigger than ours, it does make me think in a way about how the human form, when you were talking about certain things aligning mathematically for you to believe that the solar system is pretty much the only one, would you apply the same to the human form, where their form with the taller forehead is in a way a deviation, or is that our bias being humans to think that their taller forehead is something that's weird?
It's look, the morphology of their, and by the way, I get into detail about this again in Closer Encounters. I talk about Boskop Man and certain anomalous archaeological, anthropological finds, paleontological finds of humans with elongated craniums and so on and so forth. And the thing with the elongated cranium is that it's a larger brain case. It fits a slightly larger brain, okay? So their brains are a little bit larger than ours. And, well, okay, now this gets very controversial, okay? This is why I get canceled, because I'm bringing up things like this, which are the reality behind the close encounter phenomenon, which I don't know how they intend to explain these things to people as part of disclosure when they want to cancel me for talking about them, okay? But look, the reality of the situation is that we had an advanced form of human life on this planet, probably in the time of the dinosaurs, having come from Mars, while dinosaurs were still a dominant species on Earth. There's evidence that it goes that far back, and that these people engineered the moon as a terraforming device to change the ecosystem of the Earth in a way that would make it conducive to supporting humanoid life. Okay. And then they engineered, and now notice, you're talking about the time of the dinosaurs, and now I'm about to talk about the manipulation of hominids and of upright apes. Okay. And so someone listening to this is going, well, what are you talking about? Like tens of millions of years, are in that interval. No. Remember, they have time travel. They're hyperdimensional. So they can move. They can start a project in 60 million BC, and then they can go, they can map out computationally what a certain evolutionary trajectory is going to be for, let's say, a life form they've seeded or a life form that they've created the ecological conditions for. And then they can fast forward 30 million years and then engage in the second phase of the project. And the second phase of the project is that they tinkered with apes to produce various hominid life forms. Remember, there were races of man on Earth, not one human race. They love to tell us that, there's only one human race. We're all one race. No, actually, that's not true. There were different human races, humanoid races, like the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and various other ones, Java man. They were all very different from each other. And it is now scientifically beyond question. It's been demonstrated by the latest genetics research and gene sequencing that different human ethnocultural populations have different degrees of the genes of various extinct hominids. So that, for example, you don't find Neanderthal genes among Black Africans. You don't find Denisovan genes among white Europeans. And based on what we know about how different these various hominids were from one another, including in their cognitive capacity, we can see how different human genotypes, haplogroups, different human haplogroups may have different cognitive and behavioral characteristics from one another, which are a result of variant genetic heritage from extinct hominids. Okay? So first of all, the concept of race is not as inaccurate as these SJW politically correct, pseudoscientists claim. It's actually very scientifically legitimate. Second, no, this is important. Let me finish because I'm going to be taken out of context here. Second, these races were created in an unequal hierarchy. And this is what the caste system was about. Caste in Sanskrit is the word varna. We get varnish from that in English. English is an Indo-European language, it's an Aryan language like Sanskrit. Varnish is a cognate from the same root as varna. It's a color coding system. And so what we had in the days before the Atlantean rebellion that Plato describes is a racial hierarchy on the planet where certain races were created to be slave races, certain races created to be kind of decent, moderately treated workers, and certain races created to be the master races. And a lot of our problems as a species come from the fact that we lived under that system for tens of thousands of years. Okay? So this is another thing that nobody wants to talk about in the context of disclosure, except for yours truly, and I get canceled for it. But you're not going to have any legitimate disclosure by not pointing to this elephant in the room, which is that we are a species deeply traumatized and shaped by tens of thousands of years of institutionalized racism. Racism that was part of a hierarchical control system. And by the way, the word hierarchy, in case anybody doesn't know, it comes from hieros and archi in Greek, meaning holy order. A hierarchy is a holy order. It's the order appointed by the gods. Okay? So you had these Nordic people like Zeus, Indra, whatever, and they looked like, well, the reason they're called Nordics is because they look a lot like Scandinavian people, except with slightly taller brain cases. They're like an uber Cro-Magnon phenotype. And these people who had this hyperdimensional technology made a variety of servant and slave races using hominid DNA. And what happened in Atlantis, which again I explain in my work at length, is that in the high Atlantean epoch, toward the apogee of Atlantean civilization, there was a massive Promethean rebellion against this system, which Plato describes, and which is described in the Bible. I mean, this is what, Genesis was censored. A large part of Genesis, around Genesis 6, was extracted, was redacted, and we still have it in the form of the Book of Enoch. And it describes at length what happened in the civilization of Noah, which brought God, the gods, the Elohim, to the decision to wipe the civilization out in the flood, in the global deluge, right? And it describes in detail how, they were, all flesh had perverted its ways. The humans, the Atlanteans, were even creating genetic chimera from out of animals. That's what it means when in Genesis it says, and all flesh had perverted its ways. And this is why, these things, they seem like children's stories, but there's a reason why Noah is supposed to find a pure version, of each animal, a pure version of them, because they had tampered with the genome of all the various species on the earth. That's what Noah's Ark is about. It's about finding unaltered genetic specimens. Anyway, long story short, there was this rebellion against this hierarchy, which was an intrinsically racist hierarchy. And that was what that was the beginning of the Promethean movement in world history, which then continues with like the Tower of Babel, and it continues, I think, with Zarathustra's mission and the rise of the Persian Empire as a cosmopolitan humanitarian institution. And these forces have been in conflict with one another throughout the course of history. But bottom line is this, is that you can call me a racist all you want for saying these things. They happen to be true. They're scientifically accurate. I'm not a racist insofar as I'm not affirming these racial distinctions and these methods to systematically classify and persecute and oppress people. I'm calling for the deconstruction of it. But you can't very well deconstruct it unless you recognize it and are able to trace the genealogy of it, and unless you're able to point a finger at who's responsible for it, okay? Otherwise, you're going to continue to be manipulated. So don't kill the messenger.
Yeah. What people, I think, end up being afraid of is that even if certain things like that somebody brings up, that will lead to other people who, want to use that for malevolent purposes. When they say,
which is why you have to make sure you're in charge, and that requires killing people. That's the messy fact of the matter. Listen, look, Rudolf Steiner.
Yeah.
You know what Rudolf Steiner's problem was? I can forgive the things he said about Jesus. You know what my real problem with Steiner was? That he didn't have a paramilitary force. That's my problem. When you're sitting there and you know that the brown shirts are coming, what the fuck are you doing, man? Build a paramilitary force yourself. Defend the Gothanaeum with armed guards. You see, you need to think this way. It's unpleasant, but it's a reality of the situation we find ourselves in. You're absolutely right, Lev. If people come out with the truth about race and why there are these genetic differences between various ethnic groups, and what it has to do with hominids and all that will inevitably be capitalized upon by racist, fascist people who will build an institution more oppressive than Nazi Germany, unless the people bringing out that information have a more powerful military or paramilitary structure. That is the reality of the situation. That's the reality, which is why, this flag exists. Okay? And this was the naivete of people like Rudolf Steiner and the inaction of types like him who could really have prevented, a lot of the horrors of the Second World War if they had been, a little bit more courageous, disciplined, and organized.
Very interesting. Yeah, I do imagine Rudolf Steiner with a paramilitary army. That's a pretty interesting visual. So next, we got a couple left here. Gabriel Hutchinson, $9.99. Hello, Dr. Jorjani. How would a trickster phenomenon operate in a post-disclosure world? How would a cosmic force surprise us in a world where we can see around the corners? Hail, Prometheus.
The trickster wants us to surprise her. That's how it works in a post-disclosure world. Okay? It's a shift in the relationship where we cease to be always the passive member in this relationship and we start to become more active, right? That's the kind of change that this entity is looking for. So that in a post-disclosure world or a post-singularity world, we take control of our own destiny as a species. Let's say not the human species, a superhuman species, a post-human species, a species of Übermenschen, as Nietzsche put it, right? And it's our job to surprise this trickster. It's our job to embody the trickster archetype ourselves in ways that entertain and inspire this cosmic intelligence.
Very good. Next question, Andrew Christie for $20. Jason, what's your take on the onslaught of NDE OBE channels on YouTube, the Ascension 5D content, and its opposite, the Soul Trap?
Okay, I'm not aware of a lot of this stuff. I don't follow a lot of this stuff that this person is referring to, but I get the essence of the question. And I've written about this again at length, and it's another element of my work that I think people find very disturbing, which is that I've revealed in studies of cases like the case of Betty Andreasson, the American housewife who was abducted in the 60s. There are cases like the Andreasson affair, which show that these overlords have what you might call a psychotronic technology. This is why I named this book Psychotron. Ultimately, you'll see. It has to do with a technology that is capable of manipulating psychic phenomena and engineering on a spectral level. Okay, so we were saying earlier in this conversation that UFOs require a psychic to properly operate their guidance system. So that's psychotronic technology. There's also psychotronic technology that can capture your soul after you die. And I talk about cases that suggest that this is happening. Okay, close encounter cases that are also like near-death experiences, intersections of near-death experiences with close encounter cases that suggest that these gray entities that are engineered by the Nordics are actually involved not just in abducting people while they're alive, they capture people's souls after they're dead sometimes. And they will use a light to do this. They will make you see a tunnel of light, and they'll create a simulacrum of your family on the other side of it, or a simulacrum of Jesus or of some Hindu god or whatever you believe in. And they'll use it as a magnet to draw your soul into a trap. So if you see this light after you die, don't go into the light.
But that also...
It is a soul trap being generated by psychotronic technology, and these entities have a way to use people's psychic energy to do various things, okay? They also are able to direct people to reincarnate into less than optimal circumstances by maneuvering their soul through what the Tibetans call the Bardo state, using this psychotronic technology, okay, by distracting them, diverting them, luring them in various ways to basically force them into a less than optimal rebirth. And so, yes, I suppose if you want to, the person asking this question is setting up a binary between, like, go into the light NDE research on the one hand and people talking about soul traps on the other hand. And my research has led me to the conclusion that soul traps are a real thing, and that they are used by these overlords. They have the psychotronic technology, and that it's very important to have your wits about you in the after-death state, or the state of transition between death and rebirth, so that you are not manipulated, captured and manipulated by this psychotronic technology, which again employs the symbolism of all the religions, right? So if you see Jesus, do not talk to him.
But then there's also another question. This is more of a personal thing, but as you know, I see the white light when I meditate, and for me it's something that ends up generating other shapes that emanate from that. So my theory is that this is something that other people can also access. And people have written about, like, the third eye, things of that nature. How do you relate that to the soul trap?
That's because different. That's an altered state of consciousness, which you can, cultivate through developing your own latent ability. There are various rarefied states of consciousness, which are described at length, by the way, in Buddhist texts. They call them the jhanas. And Gautama, in the Theravada texts in particular, describes at length these various altered states of consciousness and the types of beings who hang out on those planes, like, for example, the DMT elves. That's a whole realm that could potentially be accessed even without using DMT. And so there are these different, altered states of consciousness, and there are beings that are more or less focused on one or another of these. Plane is a very metaphysically misleading term to use, but okay, planes of I forget that. I'm not going to say planes of reality. Domains characterized by one or another altered state of consciousness. There are beings that where that's their predominant experience rather than our realm of experience. And you can access those. That's different. When people die and they're floating above their body in a hospital because they've just gone into, they flatlined and they can't be, they're not succeeding in resuscitating this individual. And this person finds himself floating above his body and then goes through various floors and winds up on the roof of the hospital and sees that there's like a discarded sneaker there. And then later, when they've been able to revive this person successfully, this person says, the weirdest shit happened to me when I was dead. Is I was up there on the roof of the hospital and there was the sneaker there. And then they go up, they send the staff up there and they find the sneaker. Real case. So the into the light is a situation where someone is in that kind of state, wandering around the hospital, floating above it. Maybe, maybe they wander down the block or a few blocks while the ER people are still trying to resuscitate them. And all of a sudden, this white light appears somewhere in their environment. And it's attractive. And they look at it. They look at this light. And then they see this light becomes like a tunnel. And they know their family's waiting for them on the other side of the tunnel. They just know this. It comes to them. Okay, this is a soul trap scenario. That's a technology. It exists. They have it on the moon. Gurdjieff was on. He was right on about a few weird things that he said. Like that souls are food for the moon. That the moon eats human souls. He kind of he was seeing that through a glass darkly. Okay, they have this psychotronic technology on the moon, and they use it to manipulate the afterlife state. So you have to be very careful, and that's another thing. Which how are they going to explain any of this shit to people? How are you going to have disclosure? You're not going to have disclosure. You're not going to have any disclosure that that the masses can survive. You will have a lie, a monstrous, gigantic lie crafted for the sake of maintaining a herd of cattle and for making sure that the minuscule minority of people in the world who are ready for an evolutionary leap never take that evolutionary leap because it would destroy the control system. That's what we're being set up for right now.
The only quick thing to follow up on that with is that white light, at least to me, it also seems to act as a tunnel in a way. Like it seems like there is a tunnel that I see during meditation, and at the very center is this light. So would you give any credence to the idea that at least conceptually there are similarities between this artificial one and whatever is going on in terms of meditation?
I don't know, Lev. I would have to be in the state that you were in to be able to draw any kind of a legitimate comparison, because what's described in many, many parallel, cases of near-death experiences in terms of the tunnel, the light and the tunnel and the beings, family, religious figures, etc. They're seeing. It's very consistent, and it has very clear properties to it. And so I don't know, how that lines up with what you experienced exactly. I'd have to be in that state to tell you what I thought. But I'll also add that if advanced beings who have psychotronic technology wanted to design a soul trap, they might very well use aspects of actual altered states of consciousness to model the soul trap on. That's another thing that would need to be considered.
Very interesting. Maybe if you like, I could teach you later how to do it. But anyway, let us continue on. We have just a few left. So Chucky G, same super chat, by the way, sent twice. So thank you very much. Total $20. Chucky, you're the man. Mr. Jorjani, what is your opinion on Rh negative blood type?
Well, I think it goes back to what I was discussing earlier in terms of the genetic manipulation that's taken place in the course of close encounters throughout human history. That Rh negative is probably a marker that has to do with the Atlantean population, with a certain segment of the Atlantean population, and it's probably one of many indicators that the genetic variance of the human population is not entirely natural and has not been the result of purely haphazard Darwinian evolution. It's been tampered with massively.
And the final super chat of the day, which just came in, and this is from a person who lives up to their name, apparently, because their name is Payman, Payman, $99.99 from Payman.
It is the most crass bastardization of a Persian name I've ever heard in my life. It never occurred to me. It's unfortunate for this poor Payman who's contributed to your platform. Payman, yeah, it's a Persian name. Anyway.
That's, by the way, the greatest superhero of all time, at least for Break the Rules. A superhero called Payman who goes in and just, super chats. Anyway, Dr. Jorjani, I'm a big fan and thank you for all of your work. And a big thank you to Lev, creating a great space for interview and super chat. Thank you very much. Be sure to check out the rest of Break the Rules, by the way. Anyway, one quick question. Do you see any relation to the UFO phenomena and the story of Muhammad going to Mirage?
Of course. I mean, Prometheus and Atlas, it's featured prominently in my first book, right? I mean, he took a ride. And the funny thing about that story is that when they drop Muhammad off again, the door that he exited to leave his house to get on the Buraq, the aerial conveyance that takes him to Jerusalem, where then he goes up into the heavens from there, right? When they drop him back off, the door to his house is still swinging on its hinge from his having exited the house. In other words, the story is telling you that space-time manipulation is at work here. They brought him back to the instant where they took him, as if no time elapsed. They talk about missing time, Bud Hopkins research, missing time, huge element of the close encounter phenomenon. These temporal distortions that take place where for an abductee, only a certain amount of time seems to have gone by. But when they're brought back, they realize that it's been a lot longer for the people who were left behind, or vice versa. So there's a lot of temporal distortion around this phenomenon. And this case of Muhammad making the night flight, he gets on the night flight, he took the red eye to Jerusalem, and then straight up into the heavens to talk to the angels. So yeah, I discuss it. Look, the Quran was mediumistically put into the mind of Muhammad. I make the case for this in Prometheus and Atlas. I think it's in the second to last chapter or the last chapter. And I compare Muhammad's mediumistic experiences to those of a certain European gentleman, Albert LeBaron, who was studied by William James at the Society for Psychical Research. And I showed the uncanny parallels between the case of Muhammad and the case of Albert LeBaron, who they were trying to get Albert LeBaron to start a religion too. And they told him to make a pilgrimage to this place and to that place. And they told him all this bullshit that he was supposed to write in scriptures. Except the problem is that Albert LeBaron spent his free time reading Kant. And he basically said, look, this is some bullshit. And he checked himself into the Society for Psychical Research and had himself studied. And they found out that, listen, good sir, you're being subjected to telepathic hypnosis. Don't listen to these entities. And so he avoided becoming another Muhammad. You know who didn't avoid becoming another Muhammad? Joseph Smith. That's another one of these cases where if you look into the founding of the Mormon religion by Joseph Smith is a contactee. The entities told him where to go and where he would find what. And this angel moron would show up in his room and talk to him. Moron eye, the angel moron eye. And it's just like Muhammad. So it's still happening. It's not like what happened with Muhammad only happened, 1,400 years ago. It's happening all throughout the close encounter phenomenon.
Or Elijah Muhammad with the Nation of Islam, right?
Right. He was a UFO contactee also.
Yeah, so very interesting stuff. So guys, before we go, first of all, I just want to say shout out to all the people who are helping support this, grow Break the Rules. For those who are completely new to this and don't really know what Break the Rules is, what usually happens is I would bring on somebody from the insider class and the outsider class. I had a conversation recently, by the way, with Dr. Jorjani and our friend Vladislav Davidson of the Atlantic Council about Israel versus Iran, and great conversation. You can find it in the Jason Jorjani playlist in the description of this video. And I think it's very important, especially right now, to get people who would never really talk to each other to start talking. And this is my mission with Break the Rules, and how you can help support this mission is by subscribing. Number one, subscribe to this YouTube right now. Click the bell, very important, and also get that ratio of likes up, because the more this video is liked, the more this video gets recommended by the algorithm. And I think already we're fighting against the YouTube algorithm for spreading a lot of this out there. So every single like definitely matters. And how you can further support is patreon.com/breaktherules. Here I post the link in the chat. Become a patron today. Like I was talking about before, you're going to get a lot of great perks, MP3s of the episodes after they come out. You're going to get VIP events in New York City, as well as VIP events that are virtual with special guests, more of these insiders. And also for the $50 patronage, as long as you stay a patron for several months, you are going to get, if you want to, that is, a opportunity to learn how to make your own show, where I am going to be your guide and teach you how to do it, how to do OBS, promotion, all that good stuff. And lastly, but not leastly, go to levslens.com. I am also a writer, and I'm an animation director, by the way. I also do animation, but I'm also a writer. And if you go to levslens.com or follow the link that I just put in the chat, and it's also the pinned comment in the chat, you're going to see a new article I wrote called Malay versus Trump, which way McGregor, opposing leftist globalism and an expanding Russia-China power is not mutually exclusive. So be sure to check that out. It's the longest article, the most thorough article, that's a better way of putting it, the most thorough article that I have ever written as of yet, and it breaks down a lot of the things that are currently going on. I mean, not at the level of the aliens and the UFOs and stuff like that, which we talk about here, but more on the geopolitical level. So go to levslens.com right now, subscribe. You can also financially support Break the Rules from there by becoming a paid subscriber to Love's Lens, and I am going to have exclusive members-only articles coming out there as well. And now, Dr. Jason Researcher Johnny, let us know once again about the work that you are doing with the artificial intelligence project.
Well, I don't want to belabor the point. I already advertised it in enough depth and detail. So people just do go and support the fundraiser for the PSYCHOTRON AI film project. It's a litmus test for the other projects of Prometheus.
There we go. And where could people find you?
JasonRezaGeorgiani.com. It has links to all of my other platforms. I think I don't really use Facebook anymore. I mean, for obvious reasons. And plus I'm completely algorithmically suppressed on Facebook. They've completely shadow banned me. But my links to my Twitter, my YouTube channel is linked at JasonRezaGeorgiani.com. It's the Prometheism YouTube channel. You should subscribe to my YouTube channel for sure. And all my books are also linked at my website as well. There are links to the Amazon pages for my whole corpus.
And people are asking about Neil, Gnostic Informant. Unfortunately, it appears he was not able to join us today, but we are going to be having another stream about Plato coming up very soon. Hopefully, we could do it in January with yourself, Dr. Jason Riza Jorjani, Neil, and also Uber Boyo, Steph. We haven't heard from him in a while, so I look forward to having him back. And also, I completely forgot, all of you people here, go to Discord, the Break the Rules Discord server. Join it. Pump some life into the Discord server. It's going to be well worth it. So, guys, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Jason. I always love talking to you. It's always a mind-blowing experience, just the sheer amount of things that we end up talking about on these shows. And I look forward to next time. And also, guys, follow me on Twitter at levpo.com. I am going to, I never promote the Twitter. So here we go. Twitter.com or X, whatever.com/LevPo, LEVPO. Catch me there. And that's it. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Any final thoughts, Jason, before we go?
No, it's been a pleasure, Lev. Thanks very much.
All right, that's it, guys. Take care.